CHAPTER XXVI of the Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. CHAPTER XXVI. It was in the cruelty of it, in that sudden barbarous tearing of the children from Winny, of Winny from Ransome, and of Ransome from his home, in that hurried surreptitious flight through the darkness, that he most felt the pressure and the malignant pinch of poverty. Owing to his straitened circumstances, with all his mother's forethought and goodwill, with all the combined resources of their ingenuity, they could do no better than meet his lamentable case than this. This, indeed, was imperative, inevitable. He reflected bitterly that if he had been a rich man, like the manager or the secretary of Woolridge's, instead of a ledger clerk (that was all that his last rise had made him), at $150 a year, he would have been spared this. It would have been neither inevitable nor imperative. It simply wouldn't have happened. He would have had a house with a staff of competent servants, a nurse for the children, a cook, and maybe a housemaid to manage for him, and so forth. Winny wouldn't have come into it. And it would never have occurred to her to run the risk she had run for him. There would have been no need. She would have remained, serene, beautiful in sympathy, outside his calamity, untouched by its sordidness, its taint. All the machinery of his household would have gone on in spite of it, without any hitch or dislocation, working all the more smoothly in the absence of its mistress. That was how rich people came out of this sort of thing, right side up, smiling, knowing as they did that there was nothing to spoil the peace of it for them or make them apt to mistake it for anything but the blessing that it was. Thus they got, as you may say, the whole good out of it without any waste. At the worst, if they didn't like it, rich people, driven to flight, depart from the scene of their disaster with dignity, in cabs. But Ranny's departure, with all its ignominy, was not by any means the worst. The worst, incomparably, was the going back on Monday evening to settle up. There was a man coming from Wandsworth with a hand cart for the cots, the high chair and all the baby's furniture, and the kids' toys and the little clothes, their whole diminutive outfit, and for what he needed of his own. And when all the packing was done, he would still have to go into things. By the things he had to go into, he meant the drawers and the cupboards in his wife's room. And such things. It was as if the whole tale of her adultery, with all its secret infamy, its squalor, its utter callousness, was there in that room of the love knots and the rosebuds. In the locked wardrobe (the key was on the chimney piece where he could find it) he came on her old skirts, draggled and torn and stained as he had known them, on the muslin gown of last year, loathsome and limp, bent like a hanged corpse, and on her very nightgown of the other night, dreadfully familiar, shrinking, poor ghost of an abomination, in its corner. And under them, in a row, the shoes that her feet had gone in, misshapen, trodden down at heel, gaping to deliver up her shame. These things Winny had collected and put away in order, and hidden out of his sight as best she could. Seeing, she too, the tale they told, she had hung a sheet in front of them and locked the door on them and laid the key aside, to break in some degree the shock of them. For they were things that had been good enough for him, but not good enough for Violet's lover. She had gone to him in all her bravery, leaving them behind, not caring who found them. And there was more to be gone through before he had finished with it. There were the drawers, crammed with little things, the collars, the ribbons and the laces, and one or two trinkets that he had given her, cast off with the rest, all folded and tidied by Winny, smoothed and coaxed out of the memories they held, the creases that betrayed the slattern; and with them, tucked away by Winny, defiled beyond redemption, almost beyond recognition, the sachet, smelling of violets, and with the word Violet sprawling all across it in embroidery. All these things, the dresses, the shoes, and the rest of them, he gathered up in handfuls and flung into an old trunk which he locked and pushed under the bed. Then he set his teeth and went on with his task. In the soiled linen basket, among his own handkerchiefs as he counted them, he found one queerly scented and of a strange, arresting pattern. It had the monogram L. M. stitched into the corner. She must have borrowed it from the beast. Or else the beast had been in the house and had left it there. That finished him. Finished as he was in every sense, thoroughly instructed, furnished with details that fitted out and rounded off all that was vague and incomplete in his vision of the thing, he was still unprepared for the question with which his mother met him. "Have you told Mr. and Mrs. Usher?" He hadn't. He had forgotten Mr. and Mrs. Usher, forgotten that this prolongation of his ordeal would be necessary. "Well, you'll have to." "Of course I'll have to." "Will you go and see him?" "No. I can't. I'll write." He wrote in the afternoon of the next day at Woolridge's, in the luncheon hour when he had the ledger clerk's pen to himself. He was very brief. He received his father in law's reply by return. Mr. Usher made no comment beyond an almost perfunctory expression of regret, but he said that he must see Randall. And, as the journey between Elstree and Wandsworth was somewhat long to be undertaken after office hours, he proposed the Bald Faced Stag, Edgware, as a convenient half-way house for them to meet at, and Wednesday at 7 or thereabouts as the day and hour. Thus he allowed time for Randall to receive his letter and, if necessary, to answer it. No telegraphing for Mr. Usher, except in case of death, actual or imminent. Ransome supposed that he would have to see him and get it over. Soon after 7 on Wednesday, then, Mr. Usher having ridden over on his mare Polly and Ransome on his bicycle, they met in the parlor of the Bald Faced Stag, Edgware. Mr. Usher's friend the landlord had undertaken that they should not be disturbed. It was impossible for Ransome not to notice something queer about his father in law, something utterly unlike the bluff and genial presence he had known. Mr. Usher seemed to have shrunk somehow and withered, so that you might have said the catastrophe had hit him hard, if that, his mere bodily shrinkage, had been all. What struck Ransome as specially queer about Mr. Usher was the manner and the expression of his face. You could almost have called it crafty. Guilty it was, too, consciously guilty, the furtive face of a man on the defensive, armed with all his little cunning against a possible attack, having entrenched himself in the parlor of the Bald Faced Stag as on neutral territory. "What say to a bit of supper, my boy, before we begin business?" It was a false and feeble imitation of his old heartiness. Over a supper of cold ham and cheese and beer they discussed Ransome's father's health, and his mother's health, and Mrs. Usher's health, which was poor, and Mr. Usher's prospects, which were poorer, not to say bad. He leaned on this point and returned to it, as if it might have a possible bearing on the matter actually in hand, and with a certain disagreeable effect of craftiness and intention. It was as if he wished to rub it in that whatever else Randall forgot, he wasn't to forget that he had nothing to look to, nothing to hope for in his father in law's prospects. As if he, Mr. Usher, had arranged this meeting at the Bald Faced Stag for the express purpose of making that clear, of forestalling all possible misunderstanding. He kept it before him with the cheese and beer on the brown oilcloth of the table from which poor Randall found it increasingly difficult to lift his eyes. It was almost a relief to him when Mr. Usher pushed his plate away with a groan of satiety and began. "Well, what's all this I hear about Violet?" Randall intimated that he had heard all there was. "Yes, but what's the meaning of it? That's what I want to know." Randall put it that its meaning was that it had simply happened, and suggested that his father in law was in every bit as good a position for understanding it as he. "I dare say. But what I'm trying to get at is, did you do anything to make it happen?" "What on earth do you suppose I did?" "There might be faults on both sides, though I don't say as there were. But did you do anything to prevent it? Tell me that." "What could I do? I didn't know it was going to happen." "You should have known. You was warned fair enough." "Was I? Who warned me, I should like to know?" "Why, I did, and her mother did. Told you straight. Don't you go for to say I'd let you marry the girl under false pretenses, or her mother either. I told you what sort Violet was, straight as I could, without vilifying my own flesh and blood. Did you want me to tell you straighter? Did you want me to put a name to it?" His little eyes shot sidelong at Randall, out of his fallen, shrunken fatness, more than ever crafty in intent. He was pitiful. Randall could have been sorry for him but that he showed himself so mean. His little eyes gave him so villainously away. They disclosed the fullness of his knowledge. They said he had known things about Violet, he had known them all the time, things that he, Randall, never knew. And he hadn't let on, not he. Why should he? He had been too eager, poor man, to get Violet married. His eagerness, that had appeared as the hardy flower of his geniality, betrayed itself now as the sinister thing it was, when you thought of the name that he could have given her. Randall did not blame him. He was past blaming anybody. He only said to himself that this explained what had seemed so inexplicable, the attitude, the incredible attitude of Mr. and Mrs. Usher. How they had leaped at him in all his glaring impossibility, an utter stranger, with no adequate income and no prospects. How they had hurried on the marriage past all prudence. How they had driven him on and fooled him and helped him to his folly. But he was not going to let them fool him any more. "Look here, Mr. Usher, I don't know what your game is, and I don't care. I dare say you think you told me what you say you did. But you didn't. You didn't tell me anything. Not one blessed thing. And if you had, it wouldn't have done any good. I wouldn't have believed you. You needn't reproach yourself. I was mad on Violet. I meant to marry her, and I did marry her. That's all." "Well," said Mr. Usher, partially abandoning his position, "so long as you don't hold me responsible." "Of course I don't hold you responsible." "I'm sure me and the missus we've done what we could to make it easier for you." He gazed before him, conjuring up between them a quiet vision of the long procession of hampers, a reminder to Randall of how deeply, as it was, he stood indebted. "And we can't do no more. That's how it is. No more we can't do." "I'm not asking you to do anything. What do you want?" "I want to know what you're going to do, my boy." "Do?" "Yes, do." "About what?" "About Violet. Talk of responsibility, you took it on yourself contrary to the warnings what you had when you married her. And having taken it, you ought to have looked after her. Knowing what she is, you ought to have looked after her better than you've done." "How could I have looked after her?" "How? Why, as any other man would. You should have made her work, work with her hands, as I told you, 'stead of giving her her head, like you did, and lettin' her sit bone idle in that gimcrack doll house of yours from morning till night. Why, you should have taken a stick to her. There's many a man as would, before he'd have let it come to that. Damn me if I know why you didn't." "Well, really, Mr. Usher, I suppose I couldn't forget she was a woman." "Woman? Woman? I'd a womaned her. Look here, my boy, it's a sad business, and there's no one sorrier for you than I am. But there's no good you and me broodin' mournful over what she's done. Course she'd do it, as long as you let her. You hadn't ought to have let her. And seein' as how you have, seems to me what you got to do now is to take her back again." "I can't take her back again." "And why not?" "Because of the children, for one thing." That argument had its crushing effect on Mr. Usher. It made him pause a perceptible moment before he answered. "Well, you needn't look to me and her mother to have her." Randall rose, as much as to say that this was enough. It was too much. It was the end. "We've done with her. You took her out of our hands what had a hold on her, and you owe it to her mother and me to take her back." "If that's all you've got to say, Mr. Usher—" "It isn't all I've got to say. What I got to say is this. Before you was married, Randall, I don't mind tellin' you now, my girl was a bit too close about you for my fancy. I've never rightly understood how you two came together." There, as they fixed him, his little eyes took on their craftiness again, and his mouth a smile of sensual tolerance and understanding, as between one man of the world and another. "I don't know and I don't want to know. But however it was, I'm not askin', mind you, however it was," he was all solemn now, "you made yourself responsible for that girl. And responsible you will be held." It may have been that Mr. Usher drew a bow at a venture. It may have been that he really knew, that he had always known. Anyhow, that last stroke of his was, in its way, consummate. It made it impossible for Randall to hit back effectively; impossible for him to say now, if he had wished to say it, that he had not been warned; for it seemed to imply that if Mr. Usher's suspicions were correct, Randall had had an all sufficient warning. Impossible for him to maintain, as against a father whom he, upon the supposition, had profoundly injured, an attitude of superior injury. If Mr. Usher had deceived Randall, hadn't Randall, in the first instance, deceived Mr. Usher? In short, it left them quits. It closed Randall's mouth, and with it the discussion. and so that the balance as between them leaned, if anything, to Mr. Usher's side. "Well, I'm sorry for you, Randall." As if he could afford it now, Mr. Usher permitted himself a return to geniality. He paused in the doorway. "If at any time you should want a hamper, you've only got to say so." And Randall did not blame him. He said to himself, "Poor old thing. It's funk. Pure funk. He's afraid he may have to take her back himself. And who could blame him?" Funny that his father in law should have taken the same line as his Uncle Randall. Only whereas his Uncle Randall had reckoned with the alternative of divorce, his father in law had not so much as hinted at the possibility. End of chapter 7, part 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 26, part 2. Of the Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 26, part 2. It was almost as if Mr. Usher had had a glimpse of what was to come when he had been in such haste, haste that had seemed in the circumstances hardly decent, to saddle Ransome with the responsibility. For, if Ransome had really thought that Violet was going to let him off without his paying for it, the weeks that followed brought him proof more than sufficient of his error. He had sown to the winds in the recklessness of his marriage and of his housekeeping, and he reaped the whirlwind in Violet's bills that autumn shot into the letter box at Granville. He called there every other day for letters, for he was not yet prepared definitely to abandon Granville. The bills, when he had gathered them all in, amounted in their awful total to £20 odd, a sum that exceeded his worst dreams of Violet's possible expenditure. He had realized in the late summer and autumn of last year, before the period of compulsory retirement had set in, that his wife was beginning to cost him more than she had ever done, more than any woman of his class, so far as he knew, would have dreamed of costing. And this summer, no sooner had she emerged triumphant than, with 2 children now to provide for, she had launched out upon a scale that fairly terrified him. But all her past extravagance did nothing to prepare him for the extent to which, as he expressed it, she could "go it," when she had, as you might say, an incentive. The most astounding of the bills his whirlwind swept him was the bill from Starker's, from Oxford Street, if you please, and the bill, sent in with a cynical promptitude, from the chemist in Acacia Avenue at the corner. That, the chemist's, was in a way the worst. It was for scent, for toilette articles, strange yet familiar to him from their presence in his father's shop, for all manner of cosmetics, for things so outrageous, so unnecessary, that they witnessed chiefly to the shifts she had been put to her anxieties and hastes, to the feverish multiplication of pretexts and occasions. Still, they amounted but to a few pounds and an odd shilling or two. Starker's bill did the rest. That, the high, resplendent cheek of it, showed what she was capable of. It gave him the measure of her father's funk, for of not one of the items, from the 3-guinea costumes (there were several of them) down to the dozen of open-work lisle thread hose at 2 and 11 the pair, had Ransome so much as suspected the existence. The 3-guinea costumes he could understand. It was the 3 nightgowns, trimmed lace, at 13, 15 and 16 shillings apiece, that took his breath away, as with a vision of her purposes. Still, to him, her husband, Starker's statement of account represented directly, with the perfection of business precision, the cost of getting rid of her. It was so simply and openly the cost of her outfit, of all that she had trailed with her in her flight. Yet, as he grasped it, he saw with that mature comprehension which was now his, that, awful as it was, that total of £20 odd represented perfectly the price of peace. It was open to him to repudiate his wife's debts, in which case she would appear in the county court, which, with its effect of publicity, with the things that would be certain to come out there, was almost as bad as the divorce court. Then the unfortunate tradespeople would not be paid, a result of her conduct which was intolerable to Ranny's decency. Besides, he wanted to be rather more than decent, to be handsome, in his squaring of accounts with the woman whom, after all, in the beginning he had wronged. He could even reflect with a humour surviving all calamity that though 20 odd pounds was a devil of a lot to pay, his deliverance was cheap, dirt cheap at the money. But that was not all. There was Granville. He hated Granville. He could not believe how he ever could have loved it. The fact that he was gradually becoming his own landlord only made things worse. It gave Granville a malignant power over him, that power which he had once or twice suspected, the power to round on him and injure him and pay him back. He knew he was partly responsible for Granville's degradation. He had done nothing for this property of his. He had not given it a distinctive character. He had not covered it with creepers, or painted it green, or built a balcony. He had left it to itself. He asked himself what it would look like in 17 years' time, when it would be his. In 17 years' time he would be 42. What good would he be then? And what good would Granville be to him? What good was it now? In its malignancy it demanded large sums to keep it going, and if it didn't get them it knew how to avenge itself. Slowly perishing, it would fall to dust in 17 years' time when it came into his hands. But he had not dreamed of the extent to which Granville could put on the screw. He was enlightened by the agent of the estate company to which Granville owed its being. The agent, after a thorough inspection of the premises, broke it to Ransome that if he did not wish to lose Granville he would have to undertake certain necessary repairs, the estimate for which soared to the gay tune of £10 8 and 8 pence. It was the state of the roof, of the south west wall, and of the scullery drain that most shocked the agent. Of the scullery drain he could hardly bring himself to speak, remarking only that a little washing down from time to time with soda would have saved it all. The state of that drain was a fair disgrace, and it was not a thing of days, it dated from months back, years, he shouldn't be surprised. It was fit to breed a fever. Of course it wasn't quite as bad as the agent had made out, but Ranny, knowing Violet, believed him. It gave him a feeling of immense responsibility toward Granville and the estate company and the agent. Finally, owing to Violet's reckless management, his debts to the grocer, the butcher, and the milkman had reached the considerable total of £9 18 and 11 pence. It would take about £40 odd to clear his obligations. The question was, how on earth was he to raise the money? Out of a salary of £12 a month. He would have to borrow it. But from whom? Not from his father. To whatever height his mother kept it up, she could not conceal from him that his father was in difficulties. Wandsworth was going ahead, caught by the tide of progress. The new drug stores over the way were drawing all the business from Fulleymore Ransome's little shop. Even with the assistance of the young man, Mr. Ponting, Fulleymore Ransome was not in a state to hold his own. But John Randall, the draper, if you like, was prosperous. He might be willing, Ransome thought, to lend him the money, or a part of it, at a fair rate of interest. And John Randall, indeed, lent him £30, but not willingly. His reluctance, however, was sufficiently explained by the fact that he had recently advanced more than that sum to Fulleymore. He was careful to point out to Randall that he was helping him to meet only those catastrophes which might be regarded as the act of God, Violet's bills and the deterioration of Granville. He was as anxious as Randall himself to prevent Violet's appearance in the County Court, and he certainly thought it was a pity that good house property should go out of his nephew's hands. But he refused flatly to advance the £10 for the weekly arrears in order to teach Randall a lesson, to make him feel that he had some responsibility, and to show that there was a limit to what he, John Randall, was prepared to do. For days Ransome went distracted. The £10 still owing was like a millstone round his neck. If he didn't look sharp and pay up, he would be county courted too. He couldn't come down on his father-in-law. His father-in-law would tell him that he had already received the equivalent of £10 in hampers. There was nobody he could come down on. So he called at a place he had heard of in Shaftesbury Avenue, where there was a josser who arranged it for him quite simply by means of a bill of sale upon his furniture. After all, he did get some good out of that furniture. And he got some good, too, out of Granville when he let it to Fred Booty for 15 shillings a week. He was now established definitely in his father's house. The young man, Mr. Ponting, had shown how kind his heart was by turning out of his nice room on the second floor into Ranny's old attic. The little back room, used for storage, served also as a day nursery for Ranny's children. 6 days in the week a little girl came in to mind them. At night Ranny minded them where they lay in their cots by his bed. It was all that could be done, and with the little girl's board and the children's and his own breakfast and supper and his Sunday dinner, it cost him 30 shillings a week. There was no way in which it could be done for less, since it was not in him to take advantage of his mother's offer to let him have the rooms rent free. And underneath Ranny's rooms, between the bedroom at the back and the back parlor, between the parlor and the shop, between the shop and the dispensing room, Fulleymore Ransome dragged himself to and fro, more than ever weedy, more than ever morose, more than ever sublime in his appearance of integrity, and with it all so irritable that Ranny's children had to be kept out of his way. He would snarl when he heard them overhead. He would scowl horribly when he came across the pram, pushed by the little girl, in its necessary progress through the shop into the street and back again. But at Ranny he neither snarled nor scowled. Nor had he spoken any word to him on the subject of the great calamity. No reproach, no reminder of warnings given, none of that reiterated "I told you so," in which Ranny reflected he might have taken it out of him. He also seemed to regard his son Randall as one smitten by God and afflicted, to whose high and sacred suffering silence was the appropriate tribute. His very moroseness provided the sanctuary of silence. And all the time he drank. He drank worse than ever. Furtively, continuously, he drank. Nobody could stop him, for nobody ever saw him doing it. He did it, they could only suppose, behind Mr. Ponting's back in the dispensing room. They were free to suppose anything now, for, since Ranny's great delivering outburst, they could discuss it. And in discussion they found relief. Ranny's mother owned as much. She had suffered, that also she owned, from the strain of keeping it up. Ranny's outburst had saved her, vicariously. It was as if she had burst out herself. There were, of course, lengths to which she would never go, admissions which she could not bring herself to make. There had to be some subterfuge, some poor last shelter for her pride. And so, of the depression in Fulleymore's business, she would say before Mr. Ponting, "It's those drug stores that are ruining him." And Mr. Ponting would reply gravely, "They'd ruin anybody." Mr. Ponting was a fresh colored young man and good looking, with his blue eyes and his yellow hair sleeked backward like folded wings, so different from Mercier. Mr. Ponting had conceived an affection for Ranny and the children. He would find excuses to go up to the storeroom, where he would pretend to be looking for things while he was really playing with Dossie. He would sit on Ranny's bed while Ranny was undressing, and together they would consider piously the grave case of the Humming bird, and how between them they could best keep him off it. "It's the dispensary spirits that he gets at," Mr. Ponting said. "That's the trouble." And it always had been. "The queer thing is," said Ranny, "that you never fairly see him tight, not to speak of." "That's the worst of it," said Mr. Ponting. "I wish I could see your father tight. Tumbling about a bit, I mean, and being funny. The beastly stuff's going for him inside all the time, undermining him. There isn't an organ," said Mr. Ponting solemnly, "in your father's body that it hasn't gone for." "How do you know?" "Why, by the medicines he takes. He's giving himself strophanthus now for his heart." "I say, do you think my mother knows that?" "It's impossible to say what your mother knows. More than she lets on, I shouldn't be surprised." Mr. Ponting pondered. "It's wonderful how he keeps it up. His dignity, I mean." "It's rum, isn't it?" said Ranny. He was apparently absorbed in tying the strings of his sleeping suit into loops of absolutely even length. "But he always was that mysterious kind of bird." He began to step slowly backward as he buttoned up his jacket. Then, by way of throwing off the care that oppressed him, and lightening somewhat Mr. Ponting's burden, he ran forward and took a flying leap over the baby's cot into his own bed. Mr. Ponting looked, if anything, a little graver. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said. "Why not?" said Ranny over his blankets, snuggling comfortably. "Oh, I don't know," said Mr. Ponting, vaguely. In a day or two Ranny himself knew. His arrangements had carried him well on into October. In the last week of that month, on a Tuesday evening, He appeared at the Regent Street Polytechnic, where he had not been seen since far back in the last year. It was not at the Gymnasium that he now presented himself, but at the door of that room where every Tuesday evening from 7:30 to 8:30 a qualified practitioner was in attendance. It was the first time that Ransome had availed himself of this privilege conferred on him by the Poly. He said he wouldn't keep the medical man a minute. But the medical man kept Ranny many minutes, thumping, sounding, intimately and extensively overhauling him. For more minutes than Ranny at all liked, he played about him with a stethoscope. Then he fired off what Ranny supposed to be the usual questions. Had any shock, worry, or excitement lately? Been overdoing it in any way? Gone in much for athletics? Ranny replied with regret that it was more than 3 years since he had last run in the Wandsworth Hurdle Race. He was then told that he must avoid all shock, worry, or excitement. He mustn't overdo it. He must drop his hurdle racing. He mustn't bicycle uphill or against the wind. He mustn't jump. He mustn't run. Not even to catch a train? Not to catch anything. And the doctor gave him a prescription that ran: soda bicarbonate, 1 dram; tincture strophanthine, 2 drams. He remembered. That was the stuff he'd measured for old Mr. Beasley's heart mixture. It was the stuff that Ponting said his father was taking now. If anyone had told him 3 years ago that his heart was rocky, he'd have told them where to go to. It had been as sound as a bell when he entered for the Poly. Gym. Well, he supposed that was about the finishing touch, if they wanted to do the thing in style. He went slowly over Wandsworth Bridge and up the High Street, dejected, under the autumn moon that had once watched his glad sprinting. End of chapter 26. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 27 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 27. And in all this time he had not heard again from Violet, nor had he written to her. Then, it was in the first week of November, Violet wrote. She wrote imploring him to set her free. It was rooted in her, the fear that he would compel her to come back, that he had the power to make her. She wanted, he seemed to see it, to feel safe from him forever. Leonard had promised to marry her if she were free. She intimated that Leonard was everything that was generous and honorable. She wanted — she had so abused him for having married her — she wanted to marry Mercier, to have a hold on him and be safe. Marriage was her idea of safety now. She went on to say that if he would consent to divorce her, it would be made easy for him, she would not defend the suit. That meant — he puzzled it out — that meant that it would lie between the two of them. Nobody else would be dragged into it. Winny's name would not by any possibility be dragged in. Violet would have no use for Winny, since she was not going to defend the suit. She might, at the worst, have to appear as witness if the evidence of Violet's letters, her own admission, was not sufficient. It looked as if it would be simple enough. Why should he not release her? He had no business not to give her the chance to marry Mercier, to regulate the relation if that was what she wanted. It was his own chance, too, his one chance. He would be a fool not to take it. And as it came over him in its fullness, all that it meant and would yet mean, Ranny felt his heart thumping and bounding dangerously in its weakened state. On a Wednesday evening in November he presented himself once more at the Regent Street Polytechnic and at the door of an office where, on Wednesday evenings, an experienced legal advisor held himself in readiness to give advice. That legal advisor who had been the jest of his adolescence, whose services he had not conceived it possible that he should require. He had a curiously uplifting sense of the gravity and impressiveness of the business upon which at last, inconceivably, he came. But this odd elation was controlled and finally overpowered by disgust and shame, as one by one, under the kind but acute examination of the legal man, he brought out for his inspection the atrocious details. And he had to show Violet's letter of September, the document, supremely valuable, supremely infamous, supported by the further communication of November. The keen man asked him, as his uncle and his father in law had asked, if he had given any provocation, any cause for jealousy, misunderstanding, or the like. Had his own conduct been irreproachable? When all this part of it was over, settled to the keen man's satisfaction, Ranny was told that there was little doubt that he could get his divorce if — that was the question — he could afford to pay. Divorce was — yes, it was a costly matter, almost, you might say, the luxury of the rich. A matter for him, probably, of 40 or 50 pounds. Well, say 30, when you'd cut expenses down to the very lowest limit. Could he, the keen but kindly man inquired, afford 30? No, he couldn't. He couldn't afford 20 even. With all his existing debts upon him, he couldn't now raise 10. He asked whether he could get his divorce if he put it off a bit until he could afford it. The legal man looked grave. "Well, yes, if you can show poverty." Ranny thought he could undertake to show that all right. At the legal man's suggestion he wrote a letter to his wife assuring her that it was impossible for her to desire a divorce more than he did; that he meant to bring an action at the very moment when he could afford it, pointing out to her that her debts which he had paid had not made this any easier for him; that in the meanwhile she need not be anxious; that he would not follow her or molest her in any way, and that in no circumstances would he take her back. And now Ranny's soul and all his energy were set upon the one aim of raising money for his divorce. It was impossible to lay his hands upon that money all at once. He could not do it this year, nor yet the next, for his expenses and his debts together exceeded the amount of his income. But gradually, by pinching and scraping, it might be done perhaps in 2 or 3 years' time. His chief trouble was that in all these weeks he had seen nothing of Winny. He had called twice at the side door of Johnson's, but they had told him that she was not in; and, hampered as he was with the children, he had not had time to call again. Besides, he knew he had to be careful, and Winny knew it too. That, of course, would always help him, her perception of the necessity for care. There were ways of managing these things, but they required his mother's or his friends' co operation. And so far Mrs. Ransome had shown no disposition to co operate. Winny was not likely to present herself at Wandsworth without encouragement, and she had apparently declined to lend herself to any scheme of Maudie's or of Fred Booty's. With Winny lying low, there was nothing left for him but the way he shrank from, of persistent and unsolicited pursuit. November passed and they were in December, and he had not seen her. After having recovered somewhat under the influence of the drug strophanthus, he now became depressed, listless, easily fatigued. Up till now there had been something not altogether disagreeable to Mrs. Ransome in the misfortunes of her son. They had brought him back to her. But he had not wanted to come back, and now she wondered whether she had done well to make him come, whether, after all he had gone through, it was not too much for him, realizing as he did his father's awful state. It had gone so far, Mr. Ransome's state, that there was no way in which it could be taken lightly. And she was depressed herself, perceiving it. Mr. Ransome's state made him unfit for business now, unfit to appear in the shop, above all, unfit for the dispensary, fit only to crawl from room to room and trouble them with the sad state of his peaked and peevish face. He required watching. He himself recognized that in his handling of tricky drugs there was a danger. The business was getting out of hand. It was small and growing smaller every month, yet it was too much for Mr. Ponting to cope with unassisted. They were living, all three of them, in a state of tension most fretting to the nerves. The whole house fairly vibrated with it. It was as if the fearful instability of Mr. Ransome's nervous system communicated itself to everybody around him. At the cry or the sudden patter of Ranny's children overhead, Mr. Ransome would be set quivering and shaking, and this disturbance of his reverberated. Ranny set his teeth and sat tight and stuck it, but he felt the shattering effect of it all the same. And the children felt it too, subtly, insidiously. Dossie became peevish, easily frightened. She was neither so good nor so happy with her Granny and the little girl as she had been with Winny. Baby cried oftener. Ranny sometimes would be up half the night with him. All this Mrs. Ransome saw and grieved over and was powerless to help. In Christmas week the state of Mr. Ransome became terrible, not to be borne. Ranny was working hard at the counting house. He was worn out and he looked it. The sight of him, so changed, broke Mrs. Ransome down. "Ranny," she said, "I wish you'd get away somewhere for Christmas. Me and Mabel'll look after the children. You go." He said there wasn't anywhere he cared to go to. "Well, is there anything you'd like to do?" "To do?" "For Christmas, dear. To make it not so sad like. Is there anybody," she said, "you'd like to ask?" No, there wasn't. At any rate, if there was, he wouldn't ask them. It wouldn't be exactly what you'd call fun for them, with the poor old Humming bird making faces at them all the time. His mother looked at him shrewdly and said nothing. But she sat down and wrote a letter to Winny Dymond, asking her to come and spend Christmas Day with them if, said Mrs. Ransome, she hadn't anywhere better to go to and didn't mind a sad house. And Winny came. She hadn't anywhere better to go to, and she didn't mind a sad house in the least. They wondered, Ranny and his mother, how they were ever going to break it to the Humming bird. "Your father won't like it, Ranny. He's not fit for it. He'll think us heartless having strangers in the house when he's suffering so." But Mr. Ransome, when asked if he was fit for it, replied astoundingly that he was fit enough if it would make Randall any happier. It did. It made him so happy that his recovery dated from that moment. He had only one fear, that Dossie would have forgotten Winky. But Dossie hadn't, though after 2 months of Wandsworth she had forgotten many things and had cultivated reserve. When Ranny said, "Who's this, Dossie?" she tucked her head into her shoulder and smiled shyly and said, "Winty." But they had to pretend that Baby remembered too. He hadn't really got what you would call a memory. And after all it was Ranny, Winny said to herself, who remembered most, for he gave her for a Christmas present not only a beautiful white satin sashie scented with lavender (lavender, not violets this time), but a wonderful hot water bag with a shaggy red coat that made you warm to look at it. "Ranny, fancy you remembering that I had cold feet." That night he went home with her to Johnson's side door, carrying the sachet and the hot water bag and the things his mother had given her. Upstairs in the attic she shared with 3 other young ladies, the first thing Winny did was to turn to the cookery book she had bought a year ago and read the directions "How to Preserve Hot Water Bags" to preserve them forever. End of chapter 27. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 28, Part 1 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 28, Part 1 Thus 1907, that dreadful year, rolled over into 1908. By 1910, at the very latest, Ransome looked to get his divorce. He had no doubt that he could do it, for he found it far less expensive to live with his mother at Wandsworth than with Violet at Granville. He knew exactly where he was. He had not to allow so considerably for the unforeseen. His income had a margin out of which he saved. To make this margin wider he pinched, he scraped, he went as shabby as he dared, he left off smoking, he renounced his afternoon cup of tea, and reduced the necessary dinner at his A.B.C. shop to its very simplest terms. The 2 years passed. By January, 1910, he had already paid off what he already owed. He had not raised the £30 required for his divorce. Indomitable, but somewhat desperate, he applied to his Uncle Randall for a second loan at the same interest. He did not conceal from him that divorce was his object. He put it to him that his mind was made up unalterably, and that since the thing had got to be, sooner or later it was better for everybody's sake that it should be sooner. But Mr. Randall was inexorable. He refused, flatly, to lend his money for a purpose that he persisted in regarding as iniquitous. Even if he had not advanced a further sum to young Randall's father, he was not going to help young Randall through the divorce court, stirring all that mud again. Not he. "You should wash your dirty linen at home," he said. "You mean keep it there and never wash it. That's what it comes to," said young Randall, furiously. "It's been kept. And everybody's forgotten that it's there by this time. Why rake it up again?" said his Uncle Randall. And there was no making him see why. There was no making any of them see. Mrs. Ransome wouldn't hear of the divorce. "It'll kill your father, Ranny," she said, and stuck to it. And Ranny set his mouth hard and said nothing. He calculated that if he put by 12 shillings a week for 25 weeks, that would be £15. He could borrow the other 15 in Shaftesbury Avenue as he had done before, and in 6 months he would be filing his petition. As soon as he was ready to file it, he would tell Winny he cared for her. He would ask her to be his wife. He had not told any of them about Winny. But they knew. They knew, and yet they had no pity on him, nor yet on her. When he thought of it, Ranny set his face harder. Yet Winny came and went, untroubled and apparently unconscious. She was not only allowed to come and go at Wandsworth as she had come and gone at Granville, by right of her enduring competence; she was desired and implored to come. For if she had, and Mrs. Ransome owned it, a way with the children, she had also a way with Mrs. Ransome and with Mr. Ransome. The Humming bird, growing weedier and weaker, revived in her presence. He relaxed a little of his moroseness and austerity. "I don't know how it is," said Ranny's mother, "but your father takes to her. He likes to see her about." Saturday afternoons and Sundays and late evenings in summer were her times, so that of necessity she and Ranny met. Not that they pleaded necessity for meeting. Since his awful enlightenment and maturity, Ransome had never thought of pleading anything, for he did not hold himself accountable to anybody or require anybody to tell him what was decent and what wasn't. And Winny was like him. He couldn't imagine Winny driven to plead. She had gone her own way without troubling her head about what people thought of her, without thinking very much about herself. As long as she was sure he wanted her, she would be there, where he was. He felt rather than knew that she waited for him, and would wait for him through interminable years, untroubled as to her peace, profoundly pure. He was not even certain that she was aware that she was waiting, and that he waited too. In the spring of 1910 it looked as if they would not have very long to wait. He had measured his resources with such accuracy that by June, if all went well, he could set about filing his petition. And now, seeing the thing so near and yet not accomplished, Ranny's nerve went. He began to be afraid, childishly and ridiculously afraid, of something happening to prevent it. He had a clear and precise idea of that something. He would die before he could file his petition, before he could get his divorce and marry Winny. His heart, to be sure, was better, but at any moment it might get worse. It might get like his father's. It might stop altogether. He thought of it as he had never thought of it before. He humored it. He never ran. He never jumped. He never rode uphill on his bicycle. He thought twice before hurrying for anything. Against these things he could protect himself. But who could protect him against excitement and worry and anxiety? Why, this fear that he had was itself the worst thing for him imaginable. And then worry. He had to worry. You couldn't look on and see the poor old Humming bird going from bad to worse. You couldn't see everybody else worrying about him and not worry too. He would go away and forget about it for a time, and when he came back again the terrible and intolerable thing was there. And at the heart of the trouble there was a still more terrible and intolerable peace. It was as if Mr. Ransome had made strange terms with the youth and joy and innocent life that had once roused him to such profound resentment and disgust. His vindictive ubiquity had ceased. When the spring came he could no longer drag himself up and down stairs. His feet and legs were swollen. They were like enormous weights attached to his pitifully weedy body. His skin had the sallow smoothness, the waxen substance that marked the deadly, unmistakable progress of his disease. He could not always lie down in his bed. Sometimes he lived, day and night, motionless in his invalid's chair, with his legs propped before him on a foot rest. He would sit for hours staring at them in lamentable contemplation. He could measure his span of life from day to day as the swelling rose or sank. On his good days they wheeled him from his bedroom at the back to the front sitting room. And through it all, as by some miracle, He preserved his air of suffering integrity. It was quite plain to Ranny that his father could not live long. And if he died? Even in his pity and his grief, Ranny could not help wondering whether, if his father died any time that year, it would not make a difference, whether it would not, perhaps, at the last moment, prevent his marrying. Partly in defiance of this fear, partly by way of committing himself irretrievably, he resolved to speak to Winny. He desired to be irretrievably committed, so that whatever happened, decency alone would prevent him from drawing back. Though he could not in as many words ask Winny to marry him before he was actually free, there were things that could be said, and he saw no earthly reason why he should not say them. For this purpose he chose in sheer decency one of his father's good days, which happened to be a fine warm one in May and a Saturday. He had arranged with Winny beforehand that she should come over as early as possible in the afternoon and stay for tea. He now suggested that as this Saturday was such a Saturday as they might never see again, it would be a good plan if they were to go somewhere together. "Where?" said Winny. "Wherever she liked," he said, "provided it was somewhere where they'd never been before." And Winny, trying to think of something not too expensive, said, "How about the tram to Putney Heath?" "Putney Heath," Ranny said, "be blowed." "Well, then, how about Hampton Court or Kew?" But he was on to her. "Rot," he said. "You've been there." "Well " Obviously she was meditating something equally absurd. "What do you say to Windsor?" But Winny absolutely refused to go to Windsor. She said there was one place she'd never been to, and that was Golders Hill. You could get tea there. "Right o," said Ranny. "We'll go to Golders Hill." "And take the children," Winny said. Well, no. He rather thought he'd leave the kids behind for once. "Oh, Ranny," voice and eyes reproached him. "You couldn't. You may never get a day like this again." "I know. That's why," said Ranny. The kids, Stanley, aged 3, and Dossie, aged 5, understanding perfectly well that they were being thrown over, began to cry. "Daddy, take me. Take me," sobbed Dossie. "And me." Stanley positively screamed it. "I say, you know, if they're going to howl," said Ranny. "You must." "That's it. I mustn't. They can't have everything they choose to howl for." "There," said Winny. "See? Daddy can't take you if you cry. He can't, really." She had gone, perfidious Winny, to the drawer where she knew Stanley's clean suit was. Stanley knew it, too. The children stopped crying as by magic. With eyes where pathos and resentment mingled, they gazed at their incredible father. Tears, large crystal tears, hung on the flame red crests of their hot cheeks. Winny turned before she actually opened the drawer. "Who wants," said she, "to go with Daddy?" "Me," said Dossie. "Me," said Stanley. "Well, then, give Daddy a kiss and ask him nicely. Then perhaps he'll take you." And they did, and he had to take them. But it was mean. It was treacherous of Winny. "What did you do that for, Winky?" he said, going over to her where she rummaged in the drawer. "Because," she said, "you promised." "Promised what?" "Promised you'd take them. Promised Stanny he should wear his knickers. They told me you'd promised." And he had. "I forgot," he said. They'd never have forgotten. She was holding them, the ridiculous knickers, to the nursery fire. It took 10 minutes to get Stanley into them, into the little blue linen knickers he had never worn before, and into his tight little white jersey. And then there was Dossie and her wonderful rig out, the clean white frock and the serge jacket of turquoise blue, and the tiny mushroom hat with the white ribbon. It took 5 minutes more to find Stanley's hat, the little soft hat of white felt, in which he was so adorable. They found it on Ranny's bed, and then they started. It was a great, an immense adventure, right away to the other side of London. "We'll take everything we can," said Ranny. And they did. They took the motor bus to Earl's Court Tube Station, and the tube (2 tubes they had to take) to Golders Green. The adventure began in the first lift. "Where we goin'?" the children cried. "Where we goin', Daddy?" "We're going down, down, ever so far down, with London on the top of us. All the horses" Winny worked the excitement up and up "all the people, all the motor buses on the top of us." "On top of me? And on me?" cried Dossie. "And on Daddy and on Winky?" "Will it make us dead?" said Stanley. He was thrilled at the prospect. "No. more alive than ever. We shall come rushing out like bunny rabbits into the country on the other side." Ever so far down into the earth they went, with London and then Camden Town and then Hampstead Heath, a great big high hill, right on the top of them. And then, all of a sudden, just as Winny had said, they came rushing out, more alive than ever, into the country, into the green fields. But there was something wrong with Ranny. He wasn't like himself. He wasn't excited or amused or interested in anything. He looked as if he were trying not to hear what Winny was saying to the children. He was abstracted. He went like a man in a dream. He behaved almost as if he wanted to show that he didn't really belong to them. Of course he did all the proper things. He carried his little son. He lifted him and Dossie in and out of the trains as if they had been parcels labeled "fragile with care." But he did it like a porter, a sulky porter who was tired of lifting things. And they might really have been somebody else's glass and china for all he seemed to care. Ranny was angry. He was angry with the little things for being there. He was angry with himself for having brought them, and with Winny for having made him bring them. And he was angry with himself for being angry. But he couldn't help it. Their voices exasperated him. The children's voices. The high, reiterated sing-song, "Where we goin'?" Winny's voice, poignantly soft, insufferably patient, answering them with all that tender silliness, that persistent, gentle, intolerably gentle Tommy rot. For all the time he was saying to himself, "She doesn't care. She doesn't care a hang. It's them she cares for. It's them she wants. It's them she's wanted all the time. She's that sort." And as he brooded on it, hatred of Winky, who had so fooled him, crept into his heart. "Oh, Daddy!" Dossie shouted with excitement. They had emerged into the beautiful open space in front of Golder's Green Station. "Daddy, we're bunnies now. We'll be dear little baby bunnies. You'll be Father Bunny, and Monkey'll be Mrs. Mother Bun. Be a bunny, Daddy." Perceiving his cruel abstraction, Dossie entreated and implored, "Be it!" But Daddy refused to be a bunny or anything that was required of him. So silent was he and so stern that even Winny saw that there was something wrong. She knew by the way he let Stanny down from his shoulder to the ground, a way which implied that Stanny was not so young nor yet so small and helpless as he seemed. He could walk. Stanny felt it. He felt it in the jerk that landed him. But he didn't care. He was far too happy. "He's a young Turk," said Winny. And he was. By his whole manner, by the swing of his tiny arms, by his tilted roguish smile, by his eyes, impudent and joyous, blue they were like his mother's, but clear, tilted and curled like Ranny's, Stanny intimated that Daddy was sold if he imagined that to walk was not just what Stanny wanted. And in spite of it he was heartrending, pathetic. So small he was, with all his baby roundness, accentuated absurdly by the knickers. "He's just such another as you, Ranny," Winny said. She was uncontrollable. "Such a little man as he is in those knickers." "Damn his knickers," said Ranny to himself behind his set teeth. But he smiled all the same. And by the time they had got into the wonderful walled garden of Golder's Hill he had recovered almost completely. It was not decent to keep on sulking in a place which had so laid itself out to make you happy, where the sunshine flowed round you and soaked into you and warmed you as if you were in a bath. The garden, enclosed in rose red walls and green hedges, was like a great tank filled with sunshine. Sunshine that was visible, palpable, audible almost in its intensity. Sunshine caught and contained and brimming over, that quivered and flowed in and around the wallflowers, tulips and narcissus, that drenched them through and through and covered them like water and was thick with all their scents. You walked on golden paths through labyrinths of brilliant flowers, through arches, tunnels and bowers of green. You were netted in sunshine, drugged with sweet live smells, caged in with blossoms, pink and white, of the espaliers that clung, branch and bud, like carved lattice work flat to the garden wall. Neither could he well have sulked in the great space outside, where the green lawns unrolled and flung themselves generously, joyously to the sun, or where, on the light slope of the field beyond, the trees hung out their drooping vans, lifted up green roof above green roof, sheltering a happy crowd. And even if these things, in their benignant, admonishing, reminding beauty, had not restored his decency, he was bound to soften and unbend when, as they were going over the rustic bridge, Stanny tried to turn himself upside down among the water lilies. And as he captured Stanny by a miracle of dexterity just in time, he realized, as if it had been some new and remarkable discovery, that his little son was dear to him. By slow stages, after many adventures and delays, they reached the menagerie on the south side. "Oh, Daddy, Daddy, look at that funny bird!" Dossie tugged and shouted. In a corner of his yard, round and round, with inconceivable rapidity and an astounding innocence, as if he imagined himself alone and unobserved, the Emu danced like a bird demented. On tiptoe, absurdly elongated, round and round, ecstatically, deliriously, he danced. He danced till his legs and his neck were as one high perpendicular pole, and his body a mere whorl of feathers spinning round it, driven by the flapping of his wings. "He is making an almighty fool of himself," said Ranny. "What does he do it for, Daddy?" "Let's ask the keeper." And they asked him. "He's a Emu, that's what he is," said the keeper. "That's what he does when he goes courtin'. Only there won't be no courtin' for him this time. His mate died yesterday." "And yet he dances," Winny said. "And yet he dances. Heartless bird," said Ranny. They looked at the Emu, who went on dancing as if unobserved. "Scandalous, I call it," Ranny said. "Unfeelin'." "Perhaps," said Winny, "the poor thing doesn't know." "Perhaps he does know, and that's why he's dancin'." Winny gazed, fascinated, at the uplifted and ecstatic head. "I know," she said. "It's his grief. It's affected his brain." "It's Nature," said the keeper. "That's what it is. Nature's wound him up to go, and he goes, you see, whether or no. It's the instant in him and the time o' year. You don't know no more than that." "But that," said Winny, "makes it all the sadder." She was sorry for the Emu, so bereaved and so deluded, dancing his fruitless, lamentable dance. "He is funny, isn't he?" said Stanny. And they went slowly, spinning out their pleasure, back to that part of the lawn where there were innumerable little tables covered with pink cloths, set out under the trees, and seated at the tables innumerable family parties, innumerable pairs of lovers, pairs of married people, pairs of working women and of working girls on holiday, all happy for their hour, all whispering, laughing, chattering, and drinking tea. End of chapter 28, part 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 28, part 2. Of the Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 28, part 2. On the terrace in front of the big red house were other tables with white covers under awnings like huge sunshades, where people who could afford the terrace sat in splendor and in isolation and listened to the music, played on the veranda, of violins and 'cello and piano. Ransome and Winny and the children chose a pink-covered table on the lawn under a holly tree in a place all by themselves. And they had tea there, such a tea as stands out forever in memory, beautiful and solitary. What the children didn't have for tea, Ranny said, was not worth mentioning. And after tea they sat in luxurious folding chairs under the terrace and listened to the violins, the 'cello, and piano. Other people were doing the same thing, as if they had been invited to do it, as if they were all one party, with somewhere a friendly host and hostess imploring them to be seated, to be happy, and to make themselves at home. And down the slope of the lawn Stanny and Dossie rolled over and over in the joy of life, and up the slope they toiled laughing to roll interminably down. And the moments while they rolled were golden, priceless to Ranny. Winny, seated beside him on her chair, watched them rolling. "It's Stanny's knickers," she said, "that I can't get over." "I don't want to hear of them again." The golden moments were so few. "You make me wish I hadn't brought those kids." "Oh, Ranny." Her eyes were serious and reproachful. "Well, I can't get you to myself one minute." "But aren't we having quite a happy day?" she said. what with the beautiful flowers and the music and the emu. You were sorry, Winky, for that disgraceful bird, and you're not a bit sorry for me." "Why should I be?" "My case is similar." Her eyes were serious still, but round the corners of her mouth a little smile was playing in secret by itself. She didn't know it was there, or she never would have let it play. Winny gazed fascinated at the uplifted and ecstatic head. "I know," she said. "It's his grief. It's affected his brain." "Don't you know that I want to say things to you?" She looked at him and was frightened by the hunger in his eyes. "Not now, Ranny," she said. "Not yet." "Why not?" "I want" — she was desperate — "I want to listen to the music." At that moment the violins and the 'cello were struggling together in a cry of anguish and of passion. "You don't," he said, savagely. He was right. She didn't. The music, yearning and struggling, tore at her heart, set her nerves vibrating, her breast heaving. It was as if it drew her to Ranny, urgently, irresistibly, against her will. "Not now, Ranny," she said. "Not now." And it was as if she asked him to take pity on her. "No," he said, "not now. But presently, when I see you home." "No. Not even then. Not at all. You mustn't, dear," she whispered. "I shall." They sat silent and let the music do with them as it would. And the sun dropped to the fields and flooded them and sank far away, behind Harrow on the hill. And they called the children, the tired children, to them and went home. Stanny had to be carried all the way. He hung on his father's shoulder, utterly limp, utterly helpless, utterly pathetic. "He's nothing but a baby after all," said Winny. They were going over Wandsworth Bridge. "Do you remember, Ranny, the first time you ever saw me home, going over this bridge? What a moon there was." "I do. That was a moon," said Ranny. There was no moon for them to night. It was in a clear twilight, an hour later, that he saw her home. They went half the way without speaking till they came to the little three-cornered grove beside the public footpath. It was deserted. He proposed that they should sit there for a while. "It's the only chance I'll ever get," he said to himself. She consented. The plane trees sheltered them and made darkness for them where they sat. "Winky," he said, after an agonizing pause, "you must have thought it queer that I've never thanked you for all you've done for me." "Why should you? It's so little. It's nothing." "Do you suppose I don't know what it is and what you've done it for?" "Yes, Ranny, you know what I did it for. And you see it's been no good." "How do you mean, no good?" "It didn't do what I thought it would." "What was that?" "It didn't keep poor Vi and you together." "Really?" She went on as if she were delivering her soul at last of the burden that had been too heavy for it. "I can see it all now. It did more harm than good." "How do you make that out?" "Do you mind talking about it?" "Not a bit." "Well, don't you see, it made it easier for her. It gave her the time and everything she wanted. If I hadn't been there that night she couldn't have gone, Ranny. She wouldn't have left the children. She wouldn't, really. And I hadn't the sense to see it then." "I'm glad you hadn't." "Oh, why?" "Because then you wouldn't have been there. I knew you were trying to keep it all together. But it was bound to go. It couldn't have lasted. She'd have gone anyhow. You don't worry about that now, do you?" "Sometimes I can't help thinking of it." "Don't think of it." "I won't so long as you know what I did it for." He meditated. "I know what you did it for in the beginning. But, Winks, you were there afterward." "Afterward?" "After Violet went you were doing things." "Well? And didn't you want me?" "Of course I wanted you. Did you never wonder why I let you do things? Why I can bear to take it from you? Don't you know I couldn't let any other woman do what you do for me?" "I'm glad if you feel like that about it." "I don't believe you've any idea how I feel about it. I don't believe you understand it yet." His voice thickened. "I couldn't have let you, Winny, if I hadn't cared for you. I should have been a low animal, a mean swine, to let you if I hadn't cared. I'm not talking as if my caring paid you back in any way. I couldn't pay you back if I worked for you for the rest of my life. But that's what I'm going to do if I can get the chance." She could feel him trembling beside her, and she was afraid. "Would you let me?" he said. "Would you have me, Winny?
Do you care for me enough to have me? You know I've always cared for you. Would you marry me if I was free? Don't talk about it, dear. You mustn't. And why mustn't I? It's no good. You're not free. You married Vi, dear, and whatever she's done, you can't unmarry her. Can't I? That's precisely what I can do, and it's what I'm going to do. You're not. You couldn't. It seemed to him that she shrank from him in horror. You don't understand. You're talking as if she and I cared for each other. That's at an end. It's done for. She's asked me to divorce her. Asked you? When? More than 2 years ago, and I promised. She wants to marry Mercier, and she'd better. I'd have been free 2 years ago if I'd had the money. But I've got it now. I've been saving for it. I've been doing nothing else, thinking of nothing else from morning till night for more than 2 years, because I meant to ask you to marry me. All that time? All that time. But Ranny, you know you needn't. I'm quite happy. Are you? Yes. You mustn't think I'm not, and that you've got to make anything up to me, because that would make me feel as if I'd... There's a word for it, I know, but I can't think of it. It's what horrid girls do to men when they're trying to get hold of them. As if I'd comprised... Do you mean compromised? Yes. I make you feel as if you'd compromised me? That's right. Well, I am jiggered. If that doesn't about take the biscuit. Winky, you're a blessing. You're a treasure. You're a treat. I could live for a fortnight on the things you find to say. He would have drawn her to him, but she held herself rigid. Well, but I haven't, have I? If you mean have you made me want to marry you, you have. Haven't I told you I've thought of nothing else for more than 2 years? Do you want it so badly, Ranny? I want you so badly. Didn't you know I did? Of course you knew. No, Ranny, I didn't. I thought all the time perhaps some day Port Violet would come back. She'll never come back. But if she did, if she changed her mind, perhaps she's changed it now and wants to come back and be good. If she did, I wouldn't take her. He felt her eyes turn on him through the dark in wonder. But you'd have to. You couldn't not. I could, and I would. No, Ranny, you wouldn't. You'd never be cruel to poor Vi. Don't talk about her. Don't think about her. But we must. There she is. There she's always been. And here we are. And here we've always been. Have you ever thought for a minute of yourself? Have you ever thought of me? I'm sick of hearing you say poor Vi. Poor Vi. Do you know why I won't take her back? Why I can't forgive her? It's not for what you know she's done. It's for something you never knew about. I've a good mind to tell you. No, don't. I'd rather not know. Whatever it was, she couldn't help it. You ought to know. It was something she did to you. She never did anything to me, Ranny. Didn't she? She did something to me that came to the same thing. I suppose you think I cared for her before I cared for you? Well, yes. I didn't then. It was the other way about. And she knew it. And she lied to me about you. She told me you didn't care for me. She told you? She told me. I didn't think that Violet would have done that. Nor I. She paused, considering it. How did you find out it was a lie, Ranny? Oh, I suppose I showed you. Not you. She owned up herself. When? That night she went off. She wrote it in that letter. She told me why she did it, too. It was because she knew I cared for you and was afraid I'd marry you. She wasn't going to have that. Now you know what she is. Why did you believe her? Why, Winky, you little wretch. You took care of that all right. But Ranny, if you cared for me, why did you marry her? Because I was mad and she was mad and we neither of us knew what we were doing. It was something that got hold of us. Aren't you mad now, Ranny? Well, rather. But I know what I'm doing all the same. I didn't know when I married Violet. Don't talk as if you didn't care for her. You did care. Of course I cared for her. But even that was different somehow. She was different. Why do you bother about her? I'm only wondering how you'd feel if you was to see her again. I shouldn't feel anything at all. Seeing her would have no more effect on me than if she was a piece of clockwork. He paused. I say, you're not afraid of her, he said. No, I've been through all that and got over it. I'm not afraid of anything. You mean you're not afraid to marry me?" "No. I'm not afraid." He felt her smile flicker in the darkness. It was then that in the darkness he drew her to him, and she let herself be drawn, her breast to his breast and her head against his shoulder. And as she rested there she trembled. She shivered with delight and fear. End of chapter 28. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 29 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 29. He had seen her home. At her door in the quiet avenue he had held her in his arms again and kissed her. Her eyes shone at his under the lamplight. He went back slowly, reviving the sweet sense of her. A great calm had followed his excitement. He was sustained by an absolute certainty of happiness. It was in his grasp. Nothing could take it from him. He would raise the rest of the money on Monday. He would see that lawyer on Wednesday. Then he would take proceedings. Once he had set the machinery going, it couldn't be stopped. The law simply took the thing over, took it out of his hands, and he ceased to be responsible. So he argued. For at the back of his mind he saw more clearly than ever, he could not help seeing, something that might stop it all, disaster so great, so overwhelming, that when it came, his affairs would be swallowed up in it. In the face of that disaster it would be indecent of him to have any affairs of his own, or at any rate to insist on them. But he refused to dwell on this possibility. He persuaded himself that his father was better, that he would even recover, and that the business would recover too. For the last 6 months Ponting had been running it with an assistant under him, and between them they had done wonders with it, considering. And on the Sunday something occurred that confirmed him in his rosy optimism. His father was having another good day, and they had wheeled him into the front sitting room. Upstairs in the small back room Ransome was getting the children ready for their Sunday walk when his mother came to him. "Ranny," she said, "take off their hats and coats, dear. Your father wants them." "What does he want them for?" "It's his fancy. He's getting better, I think. I don't know when I've seen him so bright and contented as he's been these last 2 days. And so pleased with everything you do for him. There, take them down, dear, quick." He took them down and led them into the room, but they refused to look at their grandfather. They turned from him at once. They hid their faces behind Ranny's legs. "They're afraid of me, I suppose," said Mr. Ransome. "No," said Ranny, "they're not." But he had to take Stanny in his arms and comfort him, lest he should cry. "You're not afraid of Gran, are you? Show Gran your pretty pinny, Doss." He gave her a gentle push, and the child stood there holding out her pinafore and gazing over it at her grandfather with large frightened eyes. Mr. Ransome's eyes looked back at her. They were sunken, somber, wistful, unutterably sad. He did not speak. He did not smile. It was impossible to say what he was thinking. This mutual inspection lasted for a moment so intense that it seemed immeasurable. Then Mr. Ransome closed his eyes as if pained and exhausted. And Ranny stooped and whispered, "Kiss him, Dossie. Kiss poor Gran." The child, perceiving pity somewhere and awed into submission, did her best, but her kiss barely brushed the sallow, waxen face. And as he felt her there, Mr. Ransome opened his eyes suddenly and looked at her again, and Dossie, terrified, turned away and burst out crying. "She's shy. She's a silly little girl," said Ranny, as he led her away. He knew that in the moment when the child had turned from him his father had felt outcast from life and utterly alone. Mr. Ransome stirred and looked after him. "You come back here," he said. "I've something to say to you." Ranny took the children to his mother and went back. Mr. Ransome was sitting up in his chair. He had roused himself. He looked strangely intelligent and alert. He signed to his son to sit near him. "How old are those children?" he said. Dossie was 5 in March and Stanny was 3 in April. "And they've been — how long without their mother?" "It'll be 3 years next October." "Why don't you get rid of that woman?" said Mr. Ransome.
It was as if, with effort and with pain and out of the secret, ultimate sources of his being, that he drew the energy to say it. They would never know what he was thinking, never know, as Ranny had once said, what was going on inside him. But of all impossible things, this was what he had come out with now. "You mean that. Father?" "Of course I mean it." "Well, then, as it happens, it's what I'm going to do." "You should have done it before." "I couldn't." "Why not?" "I hadn't the money." Mr. Ransome closed his eyes again as if in pain. "I'd have given it you, Randall," he said, presently. He had opened his eyes, but they wandered uneasily, avoiding his son's gaze. "If I'd had it. But I hadn't. I've been doing badly." And again his eyelids dropped and lifted. "Things have gone wrong that hadn't ought to, if I'd been what I should be." There was anguish in Ranny's father's eyes now. They turned to him for reassurance. As if in some final act of humility and contrition, he unbared and abased himself, he laid down the pretension of integrity. His shawl had slipped from his knees. His hands moved over it, as if, having unbared, he now sought to cover himself. Ransome stooped over him and drew the shawl up higher and wrapped it closer with careful, tender touches. "Don't worry about that," he said. "Your mother'll be all right, Randall. She's got a bit of her own. It's all there, except what she put into the business. You won't have to trouble about her." He paused. "Have you got the money now?" he said. "I shall have. To morrow, probably." "Then don't you wait." "It'll be beastly work, you know. Father. Are you sure you don't mind?" "What I mind is your being married to that woman. I never liked it, Randall." He closed his eyes. His face became more than ever drawn and peaked. His mouth opened. With short, hard gasps he fought for the breath he had so spent. Ransome's heart reproached him because he had not cared enough about his father, and he said to himself, "He must have cared a lot more than he ever let on." The way to the divorce court had been made marvelously smooth for him. His mother couldn't say now that it would kill his father. But on Monday morning things did not go with Ransome entirely as he had expected. Shaftesbury Avenue refused to lend him more than £10 on the security of his furniture. Still, that was a trifling hitch. Now that the proceedings had been consecrated by his father's sanction, there could be no doubt that his mother would be glad to lend him the £5. He would ask her for it that evening as soon as he got home. But he did not ask her that evening, nor yet the next. He did not ask her for it at all. For as soon as he got home she came to him out of his father's room. She stood at the head of the stairs by the door of the room, leaning against the banisters. And she was crying. "Is Father worse?" he said. "He's going, my dear. There's a trained nurse just come. She's in there with the doctor, but they can't do anything." He drew her into the front room, and she told him what had happened. "He was sittin' in his chair there like he was yesterday, so bright, and I thought he was better, and I made him a drop of chicken broth and sat with him while he took it. Then I left him there for a bit and went upstairs to the children. Dossie was sick this morning." "Dossie?" "It's nothing. She's upset with something she's eaten. And I was there with her 10 minutes perhaps, and when I came back I found your father in a fit. A convulsion, the doctor says it was. He said all along he might have them, but I thought he was better. And he's had another this evening, and he hasn't come round out of it right. He doesn't know me, Ranny." He had nothing to say to her. It was as if he had known that it would happen, and that it would happen like this, that he would come home at this hour and find his mother standing at the head of the stairs, and that she would tell him these things in these words. He even had the feeling that he ought to have told her, to have warned her that it would be so. On Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock, when Ransome should have been in the lawyer's room at the Polytechnic, he was standing by his father's bed. Mr. Ransome had partially recovered consciousness, and he lay supported by his son's arms in preference to his own bed. For his bed had become odious to him, sinking under him, falling from him treacherously as he sank and fell, whereas Ranny's muscles adjusted themselves to all his sinkings and fallings. They remained and could be felt in the disintegration that presently separated them from the rest of Ranny, Ranny's arms being there, close under him, and Ranny's face a long way off at the other end of the room. The process of dissolution had nothing to do with Mr. Ransome. It went on, not in him, but outside him, in the room. He was almost unaware of it, it was so inconceivably gradual, so immeasurably slow. First of all the room began to fill with gray fog, and for ages and ages Ranny's face and his wife's face hung over him, bodiless, like pale lumps in the fog. Then for ages and for ages they were blurred, and then withdrawn from him, then blotted out. This dying, which was so eternally tedious to Mr. Ransome, lasted about 20 minutes, so that at 8:30, when Ranny should have been listening to his legal adviser, he was trying to understand what the doctor was trying to tell him about the causes, the very complicated causes of his father's death. And with Mr. Ransome's death there came again on Ranny and his mother, and on all of them, the innocence and the immense delusion in which they had lived, in which they had kept it up, in the days before Ranny's wife had run away from him, and before Ranny's enlightenment and his awful outburst. Only the innocence was 10 times more persistent, the delusion 10 times more solemn and more unutterably sacred now. Mr. Ransome's death made it impossible for them to speak or think or feel about him otherwise than if he had been a good man. If Ranny could have doubted it he would have stood reproved. From the doctor's manner, from his Uncle Randall's manner and his Aunt Randall's, from Mr. Ponting's and the assistant's manner, and from the manner, the swollen grief, uncontrolled and uncontrollable, of the servant Mabel, he would have gathered that his wife was a good man. But Ransome never doubted it. He spoke, he thought, he felt as if his father's death had left him inconsolable. It was the death of a man who had made them all ashamed and miserable, who had tried to take the joy out of Ranny's life as he had already taken it out of Ranny's mother's face, who had hardly ever spoken a kind word to him, who, if it came to that, had never done anything for him beyond contributing infinitesimally to his existence. And even this Mr. Ransome had done by accident and inadvertence, thinking, if he could be said to have been thinking at all, of his own pleasure and not of his son's interests. For Ranny, if he had been consulted, would probably have preferred to owe his existence to some other parent. And even in his last act, his dying, in his choice of that hour, of all hours open to him to die in, Mr. Ransome had inflicted an incurable injury upon his son. He had timed it to a minute, and Ranny knew it. He had had the idea firmly fixed in his head that if he did not go to the Polytechnic and find out how to set about filing his petition that Wednesday night, he would never get his divorce. Things would happen. They were bound to happen if he gave them time. And yet that death, so ill-timed, so disastrous for Ranny in its consequences, Ranny mourned as if it had been in itself an affliction, an irreparable loss. He felt with the most entire sincerity that now that the Humming bird was dead he would never be happy again. On the Sunday after the funeral, which was on the Saturday, he sat in the front parlor with his mother and Mr. and Mrs. Randall, listening with a dumb but poignant acquiescence to all that they were saying about his father. Their idea now was that Mr. Ransome was not only a good man, a man of indissoluble integrity, but a man of unimaginably profound emotions, of passionate affections concealed under the appearance of austerity. "No one knows," Mrs. Ransome was saying, "what he was thinkin' and what he was feelin', what went on inside him, so no one ever knew. For all he said about it you'd have thought he didn't take much notice of what happened, Ranny's trouble, and yet I know he felt it something awful. It preyed on his mind, poor Ranny being left like that. Why, it was after that, if you remember, that he began to break up. I put all his illness down to that. And then the children. You might say he didn't take much notice of them. But he was thinking about them all the time, you may depend upon it. He sent for them the Sunday before he died. I'm glad he did, too. Aren't you, Ranny?" "Yes, Mother," Ranny said, and choked. "It'll be something for them to remember him by when they grow up. But they'll never know what was in his heart. None of us ever knew, nor ever will know now." "He was a good man, Emmy, and a kind man, and just. I never knew any one more just than Fulleymore. We were saying so only last night, weren't we?" "Yes, John," said Mrs. Randall. "We were saying you could always depend upon his word. And, as you say, There were things in him we never knew and never shall know. And so it went on, with tearful breaks and long, oppressive silences, until some one would think of some as yet unmentioned quality of Mr. Ransome's. Every now and then, in the silences, one of them would be visited by some involuntary memory of his unpleasantness and of the furtive vice that had destroyed him, and would thrust the thought back with horror as outrageous, indecent, and impossible. They all spoke in voices of profound emotion and with absolute unfaltering conviction. We shall never know what was in him. Always they came back to that. They dwelt on it. They clung to it. Under all the innocence and the delusion, it was as if through their grief they touched reality. They felt the unaltered, unapparent splendor and testified to the mystery, to the ultimate and secret sanctity of man's soul. Of all that Ransome was aware obscurely. He shared their sense of that hidden and incalculable and enduring life. But his own grief was different from theirs. It was something unique, peculiar to himself and incommunicable. Even he had not realized what was at the bottom of his grief until he found himself alone with it, walking with it on the road to Southfields. He had left the Randalls with his mother and had escaped, with an irritable longing for the darkness and the open air. He knew that the reason why he wanted to get away from them was that his grief was so different from theirs. For they were innocent, they had nothing to reproach themselves with. If they had not loved his father quite so much as they thought they did, they had done the next best thing. They had never let him know it. They had behaved to him, they had thought of him in consequence more kindly, more tenderly than if they had loved him, in which case they would not have felt the same obligation to be careful. They had never hurt him, whereas he... That was why he would give anything to have his father back again. It was all right for them. He couldn't think what they were making such a fuss about. They had carried their behavior to such a pitch of perfection that they could perfectly well afford to let him go. There was no reason why they should want him back again, to show him. All this Ranny felt obscurely. And the more he thought about it, the more it seemed to him horrible that anybody should have lived as his father had lived and die as he had died without anybody having really loved him. It was horrible that he, Ranny, should not have loved him. For that was what it came to. That was what he knew about himself. That, and nothing else, was at the bottom of his grief. And it was what made it so different from theirs. It was as if he realized for the first time in his life what pity was. He had never known what a terrible, what an intolerable thing was this feeling that was so like love, that should have been love and yet was not. For he didn't deceive himself about it as his mother, mercifully for her, was deceiving herself at this moment. This intolerable and terrible feeling was not love. In love there would have been some happiness. Walking slowly, thinking these things, or rather feeling them, vaguely and incoherently, he had come to the Grove by the public footpath. It was there that he had sat with his mother more than 6 years ago, when she had as good as confessed to him that she had not loved her husband, not, that was to say, as she had loved her child. And it was there, only the other night, that he had sat with Winny. One time seemed as long ago as the other. And it was there that Winny was sitting now, on their seat, alone, facing the way he came, as if positively she had known that he would come. He realized then that it was Winny that he wanted, and that the grief he found so terrible and intolerable was driving him to her, though when he started he had not meant to go to her, he had not known that he would go. She rose when she saw him and came forward. "Ranny, were you coming to me?" Yes. He knew it now. "Let's stay here a bit. I've left Uncle and Aunt with Mother." "How is she?" "Oh, well, it's pretty awful for her." It must be. He was sitting near her, but a little apart, staring at the lamplit road. She felt him utterly removed from her, yet he was there. He had come to her. "I don't think," he said presently, "Mother'll ever be happy again. I shan't either." She put her hand on his hand that lay palm downward between them on the seat and that was stretched toward her, not as if it sought her consciously, but in utter helplessness. There was no response in it beyond a nervous quivering that struck through her fingers to her heart. He went on. "It's not as if he had been happy. He wasn't. Couldn't have been." She fell to stroking gently that hand under her own. Its nervous quivering ceased. "You know that funny way he had, the way he used to go poppin' in and out as if he was lookin' for somebody? That's what I can't bear to think of. Like as if he'd wanted something badly and wouldn't let on to anybody about it. Nobody knew what was going on inside him all these years. That's the horrible thing. We ought to have known and we didn't. There he was, poppin' in and out, and he might have been a mile off for all we could get at him. We didn't know anything about him, not really." He mused. "That's it. We don't know anything about anybody, ever. I didn't know anything about Violet. Don't know now. I never shall know. Come to that, I don't know anything about you. Nor you about me, really." "Oh, Ranny," she whispered. It was her one protest against the agony he was making her share with him. "What do we know about anything? What does it all mean? The whole bloomin' show, the combined maze. They shove us into it without our leave. They make us do things we don't want to do and never meant to do. I didn't want to care for Violet. I wanted to care for you. I didn't want to marry her, nor she me. I didn't mean to. I meant to marry you. But I did care for her and I did marry her. I don't suppose he wanted to do like he did or ever meant to. And look how he was treated, shoved in, livin' his horrible little life down there, doin' the things he didn't mean, lookin' for things he never got, and then shunted like this, all anyhow, God knows where, before he could put a hand on anything. There's no sense in it. I wouldn't mind so much if I'd only cared for him. But I didn't. I wanted to, I meant to, but I didn't. There you are again. It's all like that, and there's no sense in it." "But you did care, Ran dear. You're caring now. You couldn't talk like this about him if you didn't care." "No. I'm talkin' like this because I didn't care. Not a rap. My God, if I thought Stanny would ever feel to me as I felt to my father, I'd go and kill myself." "But he won't, dear. You haven't behaved to him like your father behaved to you," said Winny, calmly. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. At any rate, you will know presently when you can look at it as it really is. Nobody could have done more for your father than you did. If he'd been the best father in the world, you couldn't have done more. Doin' things is nothing. Besides, I didn't. Do you know, I wouldn't go into his business when he wanted me to. I wouldn't do it, just because I couldn't bear bein' with him all the time. And he knew it." "I don't care if he did know it, Ranny. You'd a perfect right to live your own life. You'd a right to choose what you'd do and where you'd be. As it was, you never had any life of your own where your father was about. I can remember how it was, dear, if you don't. If you'd given in because he wanted you to, if you'd been boxed up with him down there from morning till night, you'd never have had any life at all. Not as much as that. And then, instead of caring for him as you did, you'd have got to hate him. And then he'd have hated you, and your mother would have been torn between you. That's how it would have been, and you knew it. Else you'd never have left him." "I say, fancy your knowin' all that." "Of course I know it. I knew it all the time." "Who told you?" "You don't have to be told things like that, Ranny." The hand she was stroking moved from under her hand and caught it and grasped it tight. "Didn't I always know you were a dear?" she went on. "You said I didn't know anything about you, but I knew that much." "Yes, but how did you know I cared for him?" "Oh, why, because you couldn't have called him the Humming bird and all those funny names you did if you hadn't cared. And of course he knew that too. That's what he wouldn't let on, dear, the lot he knew. It must have made him feel so nice and comfortable inside him to know that whatever he was to do you'd go on calling him a humming bird." "You think it did, really?" "Why, don't you remember how it used to make your mother smile? Well, then," she seemed to say, "it was all right." That was how she brought him round, to sanity when he thought his brain was going, and to happiness when he felt it so improbable, not to say impossible, that he should ever be happy again. A fortnight passed. In the 3 days following the death he had not thought once about his own concerns. He simply hadn't had time to think of them. Every minute he could spare was taken up with the arrangements for his father's funeral. Sunday had been given over to mourning and remorse. It was Monday morning and the weeks following it that brought back the thought of his divorce. They brought it back first, in all its urgency, as a thing vehemently and terribly desired, then as a thing, urgent indeed, but private and personal, and therefore of secondary importance, a thing that must perforce stand over until the settlement of his father's affairs, till finally, emerging from the inextricable tangle in which it had become involved, it presented itself as it was, a thing hopeless and unattainable. His father's affairs were worse than anything he had believed, for except for that terror born of his own private superstition, he had not really looked forward to disaster on an overwhelming scale. He had imagined his father's business as surviving him only for a little while, and his father's debts as entailing perhaps strict economy for years, but for the actual figures he was not prepared. And how his father, limited as he was in his resources and destitute, you would have thought, of all opportunity for wild expenditure, how he could have contrived to owe the amount he did owe past Ranny's understanding. Into that pit of insolvency there went all that was fetched by the sale of the stock and the goodwill of the business and all that Mrs. Ransome had put into the business, including what she had saved out of her tiny income. As for Ranny's savings and the sum he had borrowed, the whole £30, they went to pay for the funeral and the grave and the monumental stone. There could be no divorce. Divorce was not to be thought of for more than 2 years, when he would have got his rise. He broke the news to Winny, sitting with her in their little half-way grove, the place consecrated to Ranny's confidences. "I can't do different," he said, summing it all up. "Of course you can't. Never mind, dear. Let's go on as we are." It was what Violet had said to him, but with how different a meaning. "But, Winky, it means waiting years. It'll be more than 2 before I can get a divorce, and we can't marry till 6 months after. That's 3 years. I can't bear to ask you to wait so long." "Don't worry about me. I'm quite happy." "You don't know how much happier you would be. Me too." She pressed her face against his shoulder. "I don't think I could be any happier than I am." "You don't know," he repeated. "You don't know anything at all." "I know I love you, and you me, and that's enough." "Oh, is it?" "It's the great thing. Winny, do you know that if poor Father hadn't died when he did — we missed it by a day. To think it could happen like that." He clinched it with, "This combined maze has been a bit too much for you and me." Chapter 29. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 30, Part 1 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 30. Mrs. Ransome, for the first time in her life, was thinking. She called it thinking, although that was no word for it, for its richness, its amplitude, its peculiar secret certainty. You might say that for the first time in her life Mrs. Ransome was fully conscious. That with an extraordinary vividness and clarity she saw things, not as she believed and desired them to be, but as they were. She saw for the first time since Mr. Ransome's death that she was happy, or, rather, that she had been happy for more than 2 years, that is to say, ever since Mr. Ransome's death. And this vision of her happiness, of her iniquitous and disgraceful satisfaction, was shocking to Mrs. Ransome. She would have preferred to think that ever since Mr. Ransome's death she had been heartbroken. But it was not so. Never in all her life had she been so at peace. Never since her girlhood had she been so gay. This state of hers had lasted exactly 2 years and 4 months, thus clearly dating from her bereavement. For it was in May of 1910 that he had died, and she was now in September, 1912. She might not have been aware of it, but that it, her happiness, had only 6 months more to run. For 2 years and 4 months she had had her son Ranny to herself. She had been the mistress of his house, the little house that she loved, and the mother of his children whom, next to her son Ranny, she adored. For 2 years and 4 months she had made him comfortable with a comfort he had never dreamed of, which most certainly he had never known. With tenderness and care and vigilance unabridged and unremitted, she had brought Granville and Stanley and Dossie to perfection. It had not been so hard.
Stanley and Dossie she had found almost perfect from the first, more perfect than Ranny she had found them, because they were not so near to her own flesh, and not loved so passionately as he. And Granville, once far from perfect, had responded to treatment like a living thing. Maudie and Fred Booty had cherished it, they handed it on to Mrs. Ransome spotless and intact. Spotless and intact she had kept it. Spotless and intact, no doubt it would be kept when in 6 months' time she in turn would hand it over to Winny Dymond, to Ranny's second wife. He had only just told her. That was what hurt her most, that she had only just been told, when for more than 2 years he had been thinking of it. It was no use saying that he couldn't have told her before because he wasn't free. He wasn't free now, not properly, like a widower. That he would, after all, get rid of poor Violet, who hadn't in all those years troubled him or done him any harm, that had been a blow to her. She hadn't believed it possible. She had thought the question of divorce had been settled once for all 5 years ago by his Uncle Randall. And John Randall, in the meanwhile, had justified his claim to be heard and his right to settle things. He had canceled the debt that poor Fulleymore had owed him. To be sure, he could afford it. He was more prosperous and prominent than ever. He was, therefore, less than ever likely to approve of the divorce. If the idea of divorce had been appalling 5 years ago, it was still more appalling now. Since, after all, poor Violet had removed herself so far and kept so quiet, the scandal of her original disappearance had somehow diminished with every year, while proportionately, with every year, the scandal, the indecency, the horror of the divorce court had increased, until now it seemed to be a monstrous thing. And that Ranny should have chosen this time of all times, when they'd paid off all the creditors and got clear, and stood respected and respectable again. As if his poor father's insolvency, which, after all, he couldn't help, since it was the drug stores that had ruined him, as if that wasn't enough disgrace for one family, he must needs go and rake up all that awful shame and trouble after all these years, when everybody had forgotten that there had been any trouble and any shame. That was what Mrs. Ransome found so hard to bear. And that she had been deceived, that he should have let her go on thinking that it wasn't possible up to the last minute. It was Saturday, and he was going to the lawyer on Monday. She who had the first right to be told. All these years he had deceived her. All these years he had meant to do it the very minute he had got his rise. For Ransome had attained the summit of his ambition. He was now a petty cashier with a pen all to himself at the top of the counting house and an income of $200 a year. Short of making him assistant secretary, which was ridiculous, Woolridge's could do no more for him. And Winny Dymond, Mrs. Ransome reflected bitterly, though he hadn't been free to speak to her, though he was practically (it didn't occur to Mrs. Ransome that what she meant was theoretically) a married man, Winny had known it all the time. It was extraordinary, but Mrs. Ransome, who was really fond of Winny, felt toward her more acute and concentrated bitterness than she had felt toward Violet, whom she hated. She was able to think of Ranny's first wife as poor Violet, though Violet had made him miserable and destroyed his home and had left him and his children. And the thought of his marrying Winny Dymond was intolerable to Mrs. Ransome, though she had recognized her as the one woman Ranny ought to have married, the one woman worthy of him, and that she would have continued to welcome her in that capacity as long as Ranny had refrained from marrying her. For Ranny's mother knew that in Violet her motherhood had had no rival. Violet's passion for Ranny, Ranny's passion for Violet, had not robbed her of her son. Violet, not having in her one atom of natural feeling, and caring only for her husband's manhood and his physical perfection, had left to Mrs. Ransome all that was most dear to her in Ranny. Married to Violet, he was still dependent on his mother. He clung to her. He deferred to her judgment. He came to her for comfort. If he had been ill, it was she and not Violet who would have nursed him. Whereas Winny would take all that away from her. She would take, she could not help taking, Ranny utterly away. Not from malice, not from selfishness, not because she wanted to take him, but because she could not help it. She was so made as to be all in all to him, so made as to draw him to her all in all. There would be absolutely nothing of Ranny left over for his mother except the affection he had always felt for her, which, for a woman of Mrs. Ransome's temperament, was the least thing that she claimed. Her instinct had divined Winny infallibly, not only as a wife to Ranny, but as a mother. A mother Winny was and would be to him far more than if she had used her womanhood to bear him children. So that without the smallest preparation she saw herself required at 6 months' notice to give up her son. And while she blamed him for not having told her, she overlooked the fact that if she had been told, she could not have borne the knowledge. It would have poisoned for her every day of the 845 days for which in her ignorance she had been so happy. She did not attempt to deny that she had been happy. But what she had said to Ranny when he told her was, "It's a mercy your poor father doesn't know." And in that moment she thought of her happiness with a sharp pang, as if it had been unfaithfulness to her dead husband. It was at 7:30 on a Saturday evening in the last week of September, 1912, that Mrs. Randall sat alone in the back sitting room at Granville, and meditated miserably on those things. Upstairs in his bedroom overhead she could hear Ranny moving very softly, for fear of waking Stanley. She knew what he was doing. He was changing, making himself smart enough to take Winny Dymond to the Earl's Court Exhibition. Upstairs in his bedroom overhead, Ranny moved very softly for fear of waking Stanley. He was changing into a new grey suit, making himself more smart than he had been for years to take Winny to the Earl's Court Exhibition. In that shirt, glistening, high collared, in a grey blue tie, in grey blue socks and brown boots, Ranny looked very smart indeed. And the suit looked splendid, the fold down the legs of the trousers being as yet unimpaired. And Ranny looked young, ever so young still, though he was 32. The faint lines at the corner of his eyes and of his mouth accentuated agreeably their upward tilt. He had gained distinction by the increasing firmness of his face. Virile in its adolescence, it had kept its youth in its maturity. Ranny's face expressed him. It was fine and clean. It had not one mean or faltering line in it. And his figure had not, after all, deteriorated. Flabbiness was as far from him as it had been in his youth. With infinite precautions, Ranny opened a drawer where he found a small japanned tin box, very new. This he unlocked softly, and from a little canvas bag that lay in the compartment specially reserved for it, he took a sovereign, one of 4, that represented rather more than a week's proportion of his new salary. He had made up his mind that when the day came he would spend no less a sum. So great a rise could not be celebrated on less. If a cashier of Woolridge's could have been capable of saving, say, 1 9 out of that sovereign, the man who was engaged to Winny Dymond would have died rather. Of course, it was a thundering lot to spend. But then Ranny desired, he was determined, to spend a thundering lot. It was extravagant, but he wished to be extravagant. It was reckless, irresponsible, but reckless and irresponsible was what he felt. He meant to go it. He meant to have his fling just for once. And he meant that Winny, who had never had hers, nor any share in anybody else's, should taste just for once the rapture of a fling. She should have it for 3 solid hours of that delicious night in one mad, flaming, stupendous orgy at the Earl's Court Exhibition. For it wasn't really his rise that called for it. That was only a means to his divorce and marriage. It was his engagement that he proposed to celebrate. The engagement, though he could hardly believe it, was a fact. True, it could not be made public until a decent interval after the divorce, but it had been acknowledged and settled between him and Winny as soon as ever he knew that he had got his rise. They would never celebrate it at all if they didn't celebrate it now before all the beastliness began. For he knew perfectly well that it would be beastly. Winny would feel it even more than he did. She would feel it for him. Things that they had both forgotten would be raked up again, all the misery and all the shame. Now that it was imminent, he dreaded the divorce court. His Uncle Randall could not have shrunk more painfully from this public washing of his dirty linen. He would come out of the great wash house feeling almost, but not quite as unclean as if his linen had been kept at home and never washed at all. And the trail of all that nastiness would spread over the 6 months of their engagement. It would poison everything. He didn't mean to think about it or let Winny think. They were going to enjoy themselves to night while they could, while they still felt innocent and clean and jolly. He stooped for a moment over the crib where his little son lay curled and snuggling, his face hidden, his head with its crop of dark hair showing like the fur of some soft burrowing animal. He freed the little mouth muffled in bedclothes and tucked the blankets closer. He picked up Stanny's teddy bear that had fallen lamentably to the floor and laid it where Stanny would find it beside him when he woke. Treading softly, he went into the next room where Dossie lay in her own little bed beside his mother's. Her little 7-year-old girl body stretched out in all its dainty slenderness, so unlike Stanny's. He saw with a pang of sudden passion the sweet difference. Her face, laid sideways in her golden brown hair, showed already a fine edge, nose and mouth, and chin turned subtly, and carved out of their baby softness to the likeness of his own. He stooped and kissed Dossie's hair, and took without touching the sweetness of her mouth. Then he ran softly down the stairs. His mother heard him running and came to the door of the room. "You're not going out like that," she said. "Without an overcoat? It'll rain before you're back, I know. And that new suit'll be ruined." "Rot. It can't rain on a night like this. Good night, Mother. Don't go sittin' up. I don't know when I'll be in." "I'll hot some cocoa for you last thing, and leave it on the trivet." "Shan't want cocoa." "What shall you want, then?" "Oh, Lord!" His nerves were all on edge. He couldn't bear it. "Nothing!" he cried, as he rushed out. At the gate it struck him that he had been a brute to her. He turned. He rushed back to her. He put his arm round her and kissed her. "You're all right now, aren't you?" "Yes, Ran dear, I'm all right." She smiled. "Run away. And don't keep Winny waiting." Heaven only knew what it cost her. And Ranny looked back, laughing, through the doorway. "You know, Mother, it really is all right. And you're an angel." And she said, "There. Go along with you." He went. "Ranny, how nice you look." Winny herself was looking nice and knew it. She wore a green cotton gown trimmed with white pipings, and a thing she called a Peggy hat that was half a bell and half a bonnet, and had diminutive roses sewn on it here and there like buttons. They were going down the long entrance to the Exhibition between painted walls, in brilliant illumination, and in publicity that might have been trying if they had had eyes for anything except each other. Winny's eyes were brimming with joy and tenderness as she looked at him. If she loved the new grey suit, the brown boots, and the Trilby hat, she did not love them more than the shabby blue serge with the place she knew in the lining where she had mended it. All the same, it was impossible to see him in such things without that little breathless thrill of wonder and excitement. There wasn't one man at Earl's Court that night who could compare with Ranny. He made them all look weedy, flabby, pitiful, uninteresting things. And then, all of a sudden (they were at the pay gate), as she looked, astonishment, grief, and anxiety appeared on Winny's face. Something had dismayed her tenderness, dashed her joy. She had seen Ranny take out of his waistcoat pocket gold. Not 10 shillings, but a whole sovereign. And a dreadful fear awoke in her. He was going to spend it all. She knew it, something told her. She could see by the way he smacked it down, careless like. And Winny couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear to think that Ranny, who had pinched and scraped and done without things for years, should go and throw away all that on her. But anybody could see that he was going to do it, by the strange excitement and abstraction in his eyes, by the way he gathered up the change and took Winny by the arm and walked off with her. His eyes and the close crook of his arm drawing her along with him in his course, the slight leaning of his body toward hers as they went, his stride and the set of his head proclaimed that he had got her, that she couldn't escape, that he meant to go it, that he had the right to spend on her more than he could possibly afford. She could see what he was thinking. In one tremendous burst he was going to make up to her now for all that she had missed. What was more, he was going to rub it into her that he had the right to. She couldn't realize their happiness as he did. They had been cheated out of it so long that she couldn't believe in it, couldn't believe that it was actually in their grasp, the shining, palpitating joy that for 5 years had been dangled before them only to be jerked out of their hands. He wanted to make her feel it, to make her taste and touch and handle the thing that seemed impossible and yet was certain. Ranny was intoxicated. He was reckless with certainty. And Winny couldn't bear it. All the way up between the painted walls, she was trying to think what she could do to prevent his spending a whole sovereign. She knew that it was no use fighting Ranny. The more she hung on to him to stop him, the more Ranny would struggle and break loose. Persuasion was no good. The more she reasoned, the more determined he would be to spend that sovereign, and the more ways he would find to spend it. It was to be one of those mortal combats between man's will and woman's wit. Winny meant to circumvent Ranny and to defeat him by guile. And at first it looked as if it could be done easily. For at first the exhibition seemed to be on Winny's side. They had emerged from between the painted walls into Shakespeare's England, into the narrow, crooked streets under the queer old overhanging houses with the swinging signs. Hundreds of years old, Ranny said they were. And in the streets there were strange crowds, young men and young women who went shouting and singing and were marvelously and fantastically dressed. And they had glimpses through lattice windows of marvelous and fantastic merchandise. Marvelous and fantastic it seemed to Winny at first sight, but when she saw that it was just what they were selling in the shops today, the delicious confusion in her mind heightened the effect of fantasy and of enchantment. "I didn't think it would be like this," she said. But why it was like that, and why it was called Shakespeare's England, what on earth Shakespeare had to do with it, Winny couldn't think. Shakespeare? Why, he wrote books, didn't he? Plays, Winky, plays. Plays, then. And when Ranny told her that it meant that England was like this in Shakespeare's time, hundreds of years ago, and reminded her that they had a scene from one of his plays on at the Colosseum the other day, Winny thought that only made it more marvelous and more like a dream than ever. And she thought Ranny was more marvelous than ever with the things he knew. And then, having lured him into this tangled side issue, she began, as cool and offhand as you please. He gave her the opening when he asked her what she'd like to do next. "This is good enough for me," she said. For the most marvelous thing about Shakespeare's England was that you could walk about in it free of charge. He looked at her almost as if he knew what she was up to. "But you've seen it, Winky. You've seen all there is of it. You don't want to stay here all night, do you?" He had her there, with his reminder of the hours they had to put in. "Well " She was lingering in the most natural manner, as if fascinated by the exterior of the Globe Theatre, for she wished to spin out the time. She saw Ranny's hand sliding toward his pocket. "Would you like to go inside it?" he said. "No, Ranny dear, I wouldn't. At least I'd rather not if you've no objection." She spoke firmly, seriously, as if she knew something against the Globe Theatre, as if the Globe Theatre were disreputable or improper. Then it was wonderful how she contrived the little air of excited inspiration. "Tell you what," she said. "Let's go and sit down somewhere and listen to the band. There's nothing I love so much as listening to a band." She knew that they charged nothing for listening to the band. It was a prompting from the exhibition itself, proving here again that it was on her side, an entirely friendly and benignant power. "All right," said Ranny. "That's in the Western Garden." End of chapter 30, part 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Chapter 30, part 2 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 30, part 2. He took her by the arm and drew her, not to the Western Garden, but to a street (he seemed to know it by instinct) through which Shakespeare's England, iniquitously, treacherously, led them to their doom, the Water Chute. For there the exhibition threw off her mask and revealed herself as the dangerous enchantress that she was. Hung with millions of electric bulbs, crowned and diademed, and laced with jewels of white flame, She signalled to them out of the mystery and immensity of the night. For a moment they were dumb. They stood still, as if they paused on the brink and struggled, protesting against this ravishing of their souls by the Exhibition. Straight in front of them, monstrous yet fragile, its substance withdrawn into the darkness, its form outlined delicately in beads of light, in brilliants and crystals strung on invisible threads, the water chute reared itself like a stairway to the sky, arch above arch, peak above peak, diadem above diadem, tilted at a frightful pitch. Chains of light, slung like garlands from tall standards, ringed the long lake that stretched from their feet to the bottom of the stair. The water, dark as the sky, showed mystic and enchanted, bordered with trembling reeds of light. From somewhere up in the sky, under the topmost diamonded arch, there came a rumbling and a rushing. It thrilled them, agitated them. And their youth rose up in them. They looked at each other, and their eyes, the eyes of their youth, shone with the same excitement and the same desire. She knew that he had deceived her, that this was not the Western Garden where the band played. She was aware that the Exhibition was not to be trusted either, that it was in league with him against her, that if she yielded to it they were lost, and yet she yielded. The deep and high enchantment was upon her. The Exhibition had her by the hair. She was borne on breathless, unprotesting, to the white palings where the pay gate was. It was worth it. She had to own it. Never before had either of them tasted such ecstasy. From the precipitous climb in the truck that hauled them up and up to the head of the high diamonded stair, the brief exciting passage along the gangway to the boat that waited for them, its prow positively overhanging the topmost edge, the sliding lip of danger where the rails plunged shining to the blackness below, the race they had for the front seat where Ranny said they would get the best of it, and then the down rush. It was as if they had been shot, exulting, from the sky to the water, sitting close, sitting tight, linked together, each with an arm round the other's waist, and the hand that was free grasping the rail, their bodies bowed to the hurricane of their speed, with the rapture in their throats mounting and mounting, a towering, toppling climax of delight and fear, as the boat shot from the rails into the water and rose like a winged thing, and leaped, urging to the heights that had sent it forth, and dropped perilously again with a shudder and a smack, once, twice, so tremendous was the impetus. They heard young girls behind them scream for joy, but they were dumb, they were motionless, they drank rapture through set teeth. It went throbbing through them and thrilling, prolonging its brief life in exquisite reverberations. And as if that wasn't enough, they went and did it all over again. And Winny struggled. She tried to hold him back. She put forth all her innocent guile. She pitted her fragile charm against the stupendous magic of the Exhibition. She loitered, spellbound to all appearance, in the bazaar, before the streaming, shining booths that poured out their strange merchandise, Italian, French, Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. "I don't want to do anything but walk about and look at things," she said. "Why, we might have travelled for years and not seen as much." Winny seemed to be scoring points in the bazaar. Then, before she knew where she was, Ranny, with all the power of the Exhibition at his back, had bought her a present, a little heart-shaped brooch made of Florentine turquoises. That came of looking at things. She might have known it would. "I'm tired of these shops," said Winny. "We shall be too late to hear anything of the band." Thus she drew him to the Western Garden, so that for the moment she seemed to have it all in her own hands. For here there were more lights, an even more extravagant and fantastic display of electric jewelry, more garlands of diamond and crystal, illuminating, decorating everything. And there were rubies hanging in strange trees, and at their feet the glamour of light dissolved, half of it perished, gone from the world, drunk up by the earth, half living on where grey walks wound like paths in a dream, between rings of spectral green, islands of dimmed, mysterious red, so transformed, so unclothed and clothed again by glamour, as to be hardly discernible as beds of geraniums and grass. Here they wandered for what seemed an eternity of bliss. "What more do you want?" said Winny. "Isn't this beautiful enough for anybody?" Neither of them had any idea. that the beauty and the glamour of it was in their own souls, as they drank each other's mystery. "Let's just sit and listen to the band," she said. And they sat and listened to it for another eternity, till Ranny became restless. For 13 11 halfpenny was burning in his pocket. The thought of it made him take her to a restaurant where they sat for quite a long time and drank coffee and ate ices. Winny submitted to the ices. They were delicious, and she enjoyed them without a shadow of misgiving. She was, in fact, triumphant, for she looked on ices as the close and crown of everything, and she calculated that out of that sovereign there would be exactly 11 2 halfpenny left. "Well, it's been lovely. And now we must go home," she said. "Go home? Not much. Why, we've only just begun." He looked at her. "Do you suppose I don't know what you're up to? You're jolly clever, but you can't take me in, Winky. Not for a single minute." "Well then, Ranny, let me pay for something." And she took out her little purse. After that it was sheer, headlong, shameful defeat for Winky. He had found her out. He had seen through her manoeuvres, and he and the Exhibition, the destructive and terrible enchantress, had been laughing at her all the time. A delirious devil had entered into Ranny with the coffee and the ices, urging him to spend. And Winny ceased to struggle. He knew at what point she would yield. He knew what temptations would be irresistible. He'd got round her with the Alpine ride. The joy wheel fairly undermined her moral being, and on the crazy bridge Ranny's delirious devil seized her and carried her away reckless into the Dragon's Gorge. Emerging, as it were, from the very jaws of the dragon, they careered arm in arm through the rest of the Exhibition, two rushing portents of youth and extravagance and laughter, till, as if the enchantress had twisted her wand and whisked them there, they found themselves inside the palisades of the Igorrote village. A swarm of half-naked savages leaped at them. It was Ranny who recovered first. "It's all right, Winky. They're the Philippine Islanders." "Well, I never." "Nor I. Talk of travellin'." But it was all very well to talk. The sight had sobered them. Gravely and silently they went through that village. At last Ranny paused outside a hut no bigger than a dog kennel. It bore the label, "Beda and his fiancee Kodpat undergoing trial marriage." Ranny laughed. "By Jove, that tickles me," he said. "What does it mean, Ranny?" "Why, I suppose it means they try it first, and if they don't like it they can chuck it." "What an idea!" "It's a rippin' good idea, Winky. Shows what a thunderin' lot of sense these simple savages have got. You bet they're not quite so simple as they seem. They know a thing or two. Why, they must be hundreds of years ahead of us in civilization to have thought it all out like that. Think of it. That fellow Beda's had a better chance than me." They turned away from Beda and Kodpat, and presently Winny stood entranced before the little house that contained Baby Francis, born in the Exhibition, and his mother. She looked so long at Baby Francis that Ranny couldn't bear it. "Oh, look at him, Ranny. Isn't he a little lamb?" Winny's eyes were tender, and her face quivered with a little dreamy smile. "Do you want to take him home and play with him? Shall I ask if he's for sale?" "Oh, Ranny." She turned away, and he drew her arm in his. "You won't be happy till you've got him, Winky." She said nothing to that. Only her mouth, without her knowing it, kept for him its little dreamy smile. "I believe," said Ranny, "you've never reelly got over Stanny's goin' into knickers." "I'd love his knickers," she protested. "Yes, but you'd love him better if he was that size, wouldn't you?" "I couldn't love him better than I do, Ranny. You know I couldn't. And I wouldn't like him to be any different to what he is." She was very serious, very earnest, almost as if she thought he'd really meant it. Silent in the grip of an emotion too thick and close for utterance, they wandered back again to the enchanted garden where the band had played for them. The garden was silent too. The band stand was empty, black, unearthly, as if haunted by some thin ghost of passionate sound, and empty, row after row of seats in the great parterre, except for a few couples who sat leaning to each other, hand in hand, finding a happy solitude in that twilight desolation. Like worshippers strayed into some church, they joined this enraptured, oblivious company of devotees, choosing seats as far as possible from any other pair. "Hadn't we better be going?" They had sat there in silence holding each other's hands. The excitement, the delirious devil in them had spent itself, and under it they felt the heaving, dragging groundswell of their passion. To Winny it had never come before like this. Up till now it had been enough simply to be with Ranny. Merely to look at him gave her profound and poignant pleasure. To touch him in those rare accidental contacts the adventure brought them, to feel the firm muscles of his arm under his coat sleeve, stopped her breath with a kind of awe and wonder, as if in Ranny's body, thus discerned, she came unaware upon some transcendent mystery. Yet Winny knew now why, in what way, and with what terrible strength she loved him, and he her. She loved him, primarily and supremely, for himself, for the simple fact that he was Ranny. She loved him also for his body, for his slenderness, and for his strong, clipping limbs. And she loved him for his face, because it could not by any possibility be anybody else's. And in her joy and tenderness, in their engagement and in the whole adventure, this going out with him and all the rare, shy contacts it occasioned, installments of delight, windfalls of bliss that Heaven sent her to be going on with, in the very secrecy and mystery of it all, Winny felt that disturbing yet delicious sense of something iniquitous, something perilous, something, at any rate, unlawful. It was the same sense that she had known and enjoyed in the days when she went into the scullery at Granville to make beefsteak pies for Ranny. The same sense, but far more exquisite, far more exciting. She did not connect it in any way with Violet. Violet had ceased to exist for them. Violet had of her own act annihilated herself. But Winny knew that until Ranny was divorced from his wife, the law continued to regard him as married to her. So that while firm land held and would always hold her, she was aware that he and she were walking on the brink, and that by the rule of the road Ranny went, so to speak, upon the outer edge, where it was far more dangerous. She knew that he had more than once looked over, and she knew, though nothing would induce her to look, that the gulf was there, not far from her adventurous feet. Still, it was wonderful how all these years they had kept their heads. So she said, "Hadn't we better be going? I think we ought to." She had unlaced her hand from his and had turned in her seat to face him with her decision. "Not yet." "Well, soon. It's getting rather chilly, don't you think?" At that he jumped up. "Are you cold, Winky?" "My feet are, sitting." "I forgot your little feet." He raised her. "It isn't late," he said. "We can walk about a bit." They walked about, for he was very restless again. "Wherever does that music come from?" Winny said. Sounds came to them of violins and 'cellos, of trombones and clarinets, playing a gay measure, a dance, insistent, luring, irresistible. They followed it. In a vast room, fronted by a latticed screen, all green and white, roofed by a green and white awning, and having a pattern of lattice work, green and white, upon its inner walls, on a vast, polished floor was a crowd of couples dancing to the music they had heard. It came loud through the open lattices, the insistent, luring, irresistible measure, violent now in solicitation, in appeal. And over it and under went the trailing, shuffling slur of the feet of the dancers and the delicate swish of women's gowns as they whirled. Standing close outside, they could see into the hall through the lattices of the screen. They saw 40 or 50 couples whirling slowly round and round to the irresistible measure. Some were stiff and awkward, palpably shy; some with invincible propriety whirled upright and rigid, like toys wound up to the whirl. Some were abandoned to the measure with madness, with passion, with a corybantic joy. Here and there a girl leaned as if swooning in her lover's arms; her head hung back; her lower lip drooped; her face showed the looseness and blankness of a sensuous stupor. Other faces, staring, upraised, wore a look of exaltation and of ecstasy. All were superbly unaware. Winny's face pressed closer and closer to the lattice. One of her little feet went tap-tapping on the gravel, beating the measure of the waltz. For at the sound of the music, at the sight of the locked and whirling couples, her memory revived. She heard again the beating of the measure old as time. She felt in her limbs the start and strain of the wild energy, an instinct, savage and shy, moved in the rhythm of her blood, and desire for the joy of the swift running, of the lacing arms and flying feet. In her body she was standing outside the dancing saloon at the Earl's Court Exhibition, with her face pressed to the lattice. She was 27 last birthday in her body, but in her soul she was 17, and she stood on the floor of the Polytechnic Gymnasium, beating time to the thud of the barbell. She was Winny of the short tunic and the knickers, and the long black stockings, and had her hair, tied by a great bow of ribbon, in a door knocker plait. "Oh, Ranny." She looked at him with her shining eyes, half tender and half wild. "If we only could." Something gave way in him and dissolved, and he was weak as water when he looked at her. The violins gave forth a penetrating, excruciating cry, and he felt in him the tumult evoked, long ago, one Sunday evening, by the music in the Mission Church of St. Matthias's. Only he knew now what it meant. His voice went thick in his throat. "I mustn't, Winky. I daren't. Some day, you and I." It was the supreme temptation of the great enchantress, and they fled from it. The violins shrieked out and cried their yearning as they went. A scud of rain lashed the carriage windows as their train shot out of the Underground at Walham Green. When they stepped out onto the platform at Southfields, the big drops leaped up at them. "Well, I never," said Winny. "Who'd have thought it would have done that?" They scuttled into shelter. "It'll be a score for Mother. She said it would come, and I said it wouldn't." "It'll ruin your new suit." "And there won't be much left of your dress." "My dress'll iron out again. It's me poor hat." The Peggy hat was not made for rain. "I'll take it off and pin it up in me skirt. It's you I'm thinkin' of." She felt his coat to see what resistance it would offer to the rain. It offered none. It made no pretense about it. "It'll be soaked and it'll never be the same again," she wailed. But Ranny remained godlike in his calm. There was still 1 and 6pence of his sovereign left. "You can keep your hat on. We're going to take a cab." If he had said he was going to take an aeroplane she couldn't have been more amazed. It was only 7 minutes' walk to Acacia Avenue, and it was not a common cab, it was Parker's fly that he was taking. She surrendered because of the new suit. "I can count the times I've ridden in a cab," she said. "This is the third. First time it was going to Father's funeral. Second time it was poor Mother's funeral. I've never been happy in a cab till now." "Poor little girl. Next time it'll be coming from our wedding. Will you be happy then?" "I'm so happy now, Ranny, that I can't believe it." "It'll only be 6 months, or 7 at the outside." "Are you sure?" "Certain." The worst of the cab was that it cut short their moments. It had been standing a whole minute before Johnson's side door. He sent it away. For 15 seconds, measured by hammer strokes of their hearts, they were alone. On the streaming doorstep, under the dripping eaves, he held her. He kissed her sweet face all wet with rain. "Little Winky. Little darling Winky." He pushed back her Peggy hat, and his voice lost itself in her hair. "They're coming," she whispered. There was a sound of footsteps and of a bolt drawn back. Somebody behind the door opened it just wide enough to let Winny through, then shut it on him. It was intolerable, unthinkable that she should disappear like that. Through a foot of space, in a hair's breadth of time, she had slipped from him. End of chapter 30. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 31 of The Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 31. Nobody had seen them, for at this hour Acacia Avenue was deserted. The long monotonous pattern of it stretched before him splendidly blurred, rich with lamplight and rain, bordered with streaming stars, striped with watered light and darkness, glowing from lamp to lamp with dim reds and purples that the daylight never sees, and with the strange gaslit green of its tree tufts shivering under the rain. Otherwise the Avenue was depressing in its desolation. The more so because it was not quite deserted. At the far end of it the lamplight showed a woman's figure, indistinct and diminished. This figure, visibly unsheltered, moved obliquely, as if it were driven by the slanting rain, and shrank from its whipping. He could not tell whether it were approaching or going from him. It seemed somehow to recede, to have got almost to the end of the road, past all the turnings; in which case, he reflected, the poor thing could not be far from her own door. There was no mistaking his. Among all those monotonous diminutive houses it was distinct because of its lamp post and its luxuriantly tufted tree. The gas was still turned on in the passage, so that above the door the white letters of its name, Granville, could be seen. There was no other light in the windows. Entering, he closed the door noiselessly, locked it, slipped the chain, and turned the gas out in the passage. The lamplight from outside came in a turbid dusk through the thick glass of the front door. A small bead of gas made twilight in the sitting room at the back. The house was very still. His mother had evidently gone to bed, but she had left a fire burning in the sitting room, and she had set a kettle all ready for boiling on the gas ring, and on the table a cup and saucer, a tin of cocoa, and a plate of bread and cheese. He turned up the gas, put the tin of cocoa back into its cupboard, and carried the bread and cheese to the larder in the scullery. He tried the back door to make sure that it was locked, and paused for a moment on the mat. He was thinking whether he had better not undress in there by the fire and spread his damp things round the hearth to dry. And as he stood there at the end of the passage, he was aware of something odd about the window of the front door. Properly speaking, when the passage was dark, the window should have shone clear against the light of the lamp outside, with its broad framework marking upon this transparency the four arms of a cross. Now it showed a darkness, a queer shadowy patch on the pane under the left arm of the cross. The patch moved sideways, to and fro along the lower panes. Then suddenly it rose, it shot up and broadened out, darkening half the window, its form indiscernible under the covering cross. And as it stood still there came a light tapping on the pane. He thought that it was Winny, that she had run after him with some message, or that perhaps somebody else had run to tell him that something was wrong. He went to the door, and as he went the tapping began again, louder, faster, a nervous, desperate appeal. He opened the door, and the lamplight showed them to each other. "Good God!" He muttered it. "What are you doing here?" It was his instinct, not his eyes, that knew her. She had not come forward as the door opened. She had swerved and stepped back, rather, gripping her skirts tighter round her as she cowered. Sleeked by the rain, supple, sinuous, and shivering, she cowered like a beaten bitch. Yet she faced him. Shrinking from him, cowering like a bitch, backing to the edge of the porch where the rain beat her, she faced him for a moment. Then she crept to him, cowering. And as she cowered, her hands, as if in helplessness and fear, let fall the skirts they had gathered from the rain. Her eyes, as she came, gazed strangely at him, eyes that cowered, bitch-like, imploring, agonized, desirous. She crept to the very threshold. "Let me in," she said. "You will, won't you?" "I can't," he whispered. "You know that as well as I do." Her eyes looked up sideways from their cowering. They were surprised, bewildered, incredulous. "But I'm soaked through. I'm wet to me skin." She was on the threshold. She had her hand to the door. He could see her leaning forward a little, ready to fling her body upon the door if he tried, brutally, to shut it in her face. It was as if she actually thought that he would try. He knew then that he was not going to shut the door. "Come in out of the rain. And for God's sake don't make a noise." "I'm not making a noise. I didn't even ring the bell." He drew back before her as she came in, creeping softly in a pitiful submission. Though the passage was lighted from the street through the wide open door, she went as if feeling her way along it, with a hand on the wall. Ransome turned. He had no desire to look at her. He struck a match and lit the gas, raised it to the full flame, and then, though he had no desire to look at her, he looked. He stared, rather. Outside in the half darkness he had known her, as if she stirred in him some sense, subtler or grosser than mere sight. Now, in the full light of the hanging lamp, he did not know her. He might have passed her in the street a score of times without recognizing this woman who had been his wife; though he would have stared at her, as indeed he would have been bound to stare. It was not only that her body was different. that her figure was taller, slenderer and more sinuous than he had ever seen it, or that her face was different, fined down to the last expression of its beauty, changed physically, with a difference that seemed to him absolute and supreme. It was that this strange dissimilarity, if he could have analysed it, would have struck him as amounting to a difference of soul. Or rather, it was as if Violet's face had never given up her soul's secret until now. Never until now had it so much as hinted that Violet had any soul at all. The comparative fineness and sharpness of outline might have reminded him of his wife as she had looked when she came out of her torture after the birth of her first child, but that no implacable resentment and no revolt was there. It was plainly to be seen, nor did Ransome altogether miss it, that here were a body and a soul that had suffered to extremity, and were now utterly beaten, utterly submissive. This suggestion of frightful things endured was more lamentable by contrast with the shining sleekness, the drenched splendor of her attire. Ransome saw that her clothes helped to build up the impression of her strangeness. Violet was dressed as his wife, at the most frenzied height of her extravagance, had never dressed, as even Merder's wife could not have dressed, nor yet his mistress. The black satin coat and gown that clung to her body like a sheath showed flawless, though they streamed with rain. The lace at her throat, the black velvet hat with a raking plume that had once been yellow, the design and quality of the flat bag slung on her arm, were details that belonged, and Ransome knew it, to a world that was not his nor Merder's either. And as he took them in he conceived from them an abominable suspicion. His eyes must have conveyed his repulsion, for she spoke as if answering them. "You mustn't mind my clothes. They're done for." She looked down, self-pitying, at her poor slippered feet standing in a pool of rain. "I'm making such a mess of your nice hall." A little laugh shook in her throat and turned into a fit of coughing. He saw how instantly one hand went to her mouth and pressed there while the other struggled blindly, frantically, with the opening of her bag. "What is it?" "My hanky." She coughed the words out. It, the childish word, moved him to a momentary compassion. "Here you are." She stepped back from him as she stretched out her arm, then she turned and leaned against the wall, hiding her face and muffling her cough in Ransome's pocket handkerchief. Each gesture, each surreptitious and yet frantic effort at suppression, showed her a creature that some brute had beaten, had terrified and cowed. The old Violet would have come swinging up the path. She would have pushed past him into the warm and lighted room. This one had come creeping to his door. She took no step to which he did not himself invite her. "Come in here a minute," he said. He put his hand upon her arm to guide her. He led her into the warm room and drew up a chair for her before the fire. "Sit down and get warm." She shook her head, and by that sign he conceived the hope that she would soon be gone. She looked after him as he went to the door of the room to close it. When she heard the click of the latch her cough burst out violently and ceased. She crouched down by the hearth, holding out her hands to the blaze. He stood against the chimney piece, looking down at her, silent, not knowing what he might be required to say. She peeled off the wet gloves that were plastered to her skin. She drew out the long pins from her hat, took it off, and gazed ruefully at the lean plume lashed to its raking stem. With the coquetry of pathos she held it out to him. "Look at me poor feather, Ranny," she said. He shuddered as she spoke his name. "You'd better take your shoes off and that coat," he said. She took them off. He set the shoes in the fender. He hung the coat over the back of the chair to dry. As she stood upright the damp streamed from her skirts and drifted toward the fire. "How about that skirt?" "I could slip it off, and me stockings too, if you didn't mind." "All right," he muttered, and turned from her. He could hear the delicate silken swish of her draperies as they slid from her to the floor. She was slenderer than ever in the short satin petticoat that was her inner sheath. Her naked feet, spread to the floor, showed white but unshapely. She stood there like some beautiful flower rising superbly from two ugly, livid and distorted roots. But neither her beauty nor her ugliness could touch him now. "Look here," he said, "I'll get you some dry things." His mind was dulled by the shock of seeing her, so that it was unable to attach any real importance or significance to her return. He knew her to be both callous and capricious, therefore, he told himself that there was no need to take her seriously now. The thing was to get rid of her as soon as possible. He smothered the instinct that had warned him of his danger, and persuaded himself that dry things would meet the triviality of her case. He went upstairs very softly to his room. In a jar on the chimney piece he found a small key. Still going softly, he let himself into the little unfurnished room over the porch where boxes were stored. Among them was the trunk which contained Violet's long abandoned clothes. He unlocked it, rummaged, deliberated, selected finally a serge skirt, draggled but warm, a pair of woolen stockings, and shoes, stout for all their shabbiness. And as he knelt over the trunk his mind cleared suddenly, and he knew what he was going to do. He was going to fetch a cab, if he could get one, and take her away in it. If she was staying in London he would take her straight back to whatever place she had come from. If she came from a distance he would see her started on her journey home. He was prepared, if necessary, to hang about for hours in any station, waiting for any train that would remove her. If the worst came to the worst, he would take a room for her in some hotel and leave her there. But he would not have her sitting with him till past midnight in his house. It was too risky. He knew what he was about. He knew that there was danger in any course that could give rise to the suspicion of cohabitation. He knew, not only that cohabitation in itself was fatal, but that the injured husband who invoked the law must refrain from the very appearance of that evil. Of course he knew what Violet had come for. She was beginning to get uneasy about her divorce. And personally he couldn't see where the risk came in unless the suit was defended. And it wasn't going to be defended. It couldn't be. The suspicion of collusion would in his case be a far more dangerous thing. It was what he had been specially warned against. These two ideas, collusion and cohabitation, struggled for supremacy in Ranny's brain. They seemed to him mutually exclusive. And all it came to was that with his suit so imminent he couldn't be too careful. He must not, even for the sake of decency, show Violet any consideration that would be prejudicial to his case. Whereupon it struck him that the most perilous, most embarrassing detail of the situation was the disgusting accident of the weather. In common decency he couldn't have turned her out of doors in that rain. And under all the confused working of his intelligence his instinct told him that what happened was not an accident at all. His inmost prescience hinted at foredoomed, irremediable suffering, profound, irreparable disaster. But with his mind set upon its purpose he gathered up the shabby skirt, the stockings, and the shoes. He took his own thick overcoat from its peg in the passage. He warmed them well before the sitting room fire. Violet watched him with an air of detachment, of innocent incomprehension, as if these preparations in no way concerned herself. She was sitting in the chair now with her bare feet in the fender. He then put the kettle on the fire, and her eyes kindled and looked up at him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to make you a cup of hot tea before you go." "I can't go," she whispered. He was firm. "I'm awfully sorry, Violet, but you've got to." "But, Ranny, you couldn't turn a cat out on a night like this." "Don't talk nonsense about turning out. You know you can't stay here. I can't think what on earth possessed you to come. You haven't told me yet." She did not tell him now. She did not look at him. She sat bowed forward, her elbows on her knees and her chin propped on her hands, while she cried quietly, with slow tears that rolled down her bare, undefended face. He made the tea and poured it out for her, and she took the cup from him and drank, without looking at him, without speaking. And still she cried quietly. Now and then a soft sob came from her in the pauses of her drinking. Ransome sat on the table and delivered himself of what he had to say. "I don't know what's upsetting you," he said, "and you don't seem inclined to tell me. But if you're worrying about that divorce you needn't. You'll get it all right. The thing'll be sent you in a week or a fortnight." "Ranny," she said, "are you really doing it?" "Of course I'm doing it." "I didn't know." "Well, you might have known." He was deaf to the terror in her voice. "I'd have done it years ago if I'd had the money. It isn't my fault we've had to wait for it. It was hard luck on both of us." He stopped to look at her still, like some sick animal, meekly drinking, and still crying. He waited till her cup was empty and took it from her. "More?" "No, thank you." He put down the cup, turned, and went toward the door. There was a savage misery in his heart and in all his movements an awful gentleness. She started up. "Don't go, Ranny. Don't leave me." Her face was dreadful to his instinct. "I must." "You're going to do something. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to leave you to change into those things. I'm going to look for a cab, and I'm going to take you back to wherever you came from." "You don't know where I came from. You don't know why I've come." There was the throb of all disaster in her voice. His instinct heard it. But his intelligence refused to hear. It went on reasoning with her who was unreasonable. "I don't know," it said, "why you want to stick here. It won't do either of us any good." "Has it began?" she said. "Can't anything stop it?" "Yes. You can stop it if you stay here all night. If you want it to go right you must keep away. It's madness your coming here at this time of night. I can't think why you I should have thought you'd have known." "Oh, Ranny, don't be hard on me." "I'm not hard on you. You're hard on yourself. You want a divorce and I want it. Don't you know we shan't get it if " "But I don't want it. I don't indeed." "What's that?" "I don't want it. I didn't know you were divorcing me. I never thought you'd go and do it after all these years." "Rot. You knew I was going to do it the minute I had the money." "You don't understand. I've come to ask you if you'll forgive me and take me back." "I forgave you long ago. But I can't take you back. You know that well enough." She made as if she had not heard him. "I'll be good, Ranny. I want to be good." He also made as if he had not heard. "Why do you want me to take you back?" "That's why. So as I can be good. Father's turned me out, Ranny." "Your father?" "I went to him first. I didn't think I'd any right to come to you after I'd served you like I did." "Oh, never mind how you served me. What's Mercier been doing?" "He's got married." "Just like him. I thought he was going to marry you." "He wouldn't wait for me. He couldn't. He thought you were never going to get your divorce. He had to settle down so as to get on in his business. He wanted a Frenchwoman who could help him, and he daren't so much as look at me after for fear she'd divorce him." "I told you he was a swine." "He wasn't. It wasn't his fault. He'd have married me 2 years ago if you could have divorced me then." Her mouth was loose to the passage of her sigh, as if for a moment she felt a sensuous pleasure in her own self-pity. She did not see how his mouth tightened to the torture as she turned the screw. She went on. "Lenny was all right. He was good to me as long as I was with him. He wouldn't have turned me out into the street to starve." "Who has turned you into the street?" He could not disguise his exasperation. Then he remembered. "Oh, your father." "I don't mean Father. I mean the other one." "There was another one? And you expect me to take you back?" "I'm only asking you," she said. "Don't be so hard on me. I had to have someone when Lenny left me. He's been the only one since Lenny. And he was all right until he tired of me." "Who's the brute you're talking about?" "He's a gentleman. That's all I can tell you." "Sounds pretty high class. And where does this gentleman hang out?" "I oughtn't to tell you. He's a painter, and he's awfully well known. Well, it's somewhere in the West End, and we had a flat in Bloomsbury." She answered his wonder. "I met him in Paris. He took me away from there, and I've been with him all the time. There wasn't anybody else. I swear there wasn't. I swear." "Oh, you needn't." He got up and walked away. "Ranny, don't go for the cab until I've told you everything." "I'm not going. What more have you got to say?" "Don't look at me like that, as if you could murder me. You wouldn't if you knew how he's served me. He beat me, Ranny. He beat me with his hands and with his stick." She rolled up the sleeves of her thin blouse. "Look here and here. That's what he was always doing to me, and I've got worse. Bigger ones on me breast and on me body." "Good God." The words came from him under his breath, and not even his instinct knew what he would say next. He said, or rather some unknown power took hold of him and said it, "Why didn't you come to me before?" She hesitated. "He never turned me out until last night." Her pause gave him time to measure the significance of what she said. "He didn't really tire of me till I got ill. I had pneumonia last spring. I nearly died of it. And I've not been right since. That's how I got me cough. He couldn't stand it." She paused. "I ought to have gone when he told me to. But I didn't. I was awfully gone on him. And last night we were to have gone to the theatre together. But he'd been drinkin' and I said I wouldn't go with him. Then he swore at me and struck me and said I might go by myself. And I went. And when I came home he shut the door on me and turned me out into the street with nothing but the clothes on me back and what I had in me purse. And he said if I came back he'd do for me." She gutted out the abominable history in a succession of jerks, in a voice dulled to utter apathy. And an intolerable pity held him silent before this beaten thing, although with every word she dragged him nearer to the ultimate foreseen disaster. She went on. "I was scared to walk about the streets all night in these things. I always was more afraid of that than anything, though he never would believe me when I said so. You don't know the names he called me. So I took a taxi and I went to the first hotel I could think of, the Thackeray. But I hadn't enough money with me and they wouldn't take me in. Then I went and sat in the waiting room at Euston Station till they closed. Then I sat outside on the platform and pretended to be waitin' for a train. He wouldn't believe me if I told him I'd spent the night in that station. But I did. And I got me death of cold. And in the morning me cough started and they wouldn't take me in any of the shops because of it. I tried all morning. Starker's first. Then in the afternoon I went to father and he wouldn't have me. He won't believe I haven't been bad because of me things and me cough. I s'pose he thinks I've got consumption or something. He saw me comin' in at the gate and he turned me out straight. I didn't even get to the door." "He couldn't." "He did. Really, Ranny, he did. He said he'd washed his hands of me and I could go back to you. He said No, I can't tell you what he said." There was no need to tell. He knew. She looked at him now straight for the first time. "Ranny, he knows. He knows what we did." "Did you tell him?" "Not me. He'd guessed it. He'd guessed it all the time. Trust him. And he taxed me with it. And I lied. I wasn't going to have him thinking that of you." "Of me?" "Yes, you." It was her first flash of feeling since she began her tale. "It doesn't matter what he thinks of me. I told him so." "Well? Then?" "Then I started looking for work again. Couldn't get any. Then I came here. If you turn me out there'll be nothing but the streets. If I was to get work nobody'll keep me. I haven't properly got over that illness. I'm so weak I couldn't stand to do anything long. There are times when I can hardly hold myself together." And still there was no feeling in her voice and barely the suggestion of appeal. Only the flat tones of the last extremity. "I've come here because I'm afraid of going to the bad. I don't want to be bad, not really bad, but I'll be driven to it if you turn me out." It might have been a threat she held out to him, but that her voice lacked the passion of all menace. Passion could not have served her better than her dull, unvibrating statement of the fact. "If you won't take me back—" Her spent voice dropped dead on the last word and her cough broke out again. Ransome's next movement averted it. She revived suddenly. "Ranny, are you going for that cab?" He turned. "No," he said. "You know I'm not." "Then what are you thinking of?" He was thinking: I won't have Dossie and Stanny sleeping with her, and I can't turn Mother out, so there's no room for her. "Yes, there is. I can get a camp bed and put it in the box room. I shall be all right in there, and she can have my room to herself." No other arrangement seemed endurable or possible to him. And yet, while his flesh cried out, in the agony of its repulsion, it knew that in the years, the terrible, interminable years before them, it could not be as he had planned. There would be a will stronger than his own will that would not be frustrated. And he told himself that he could have borne it if it had not been for that. There was a knocking at the door. The handle turned, and through the slender opening which was all she dared make, Mrs. Ransome spoke to her son. "Ranny, do you know you've left the front door open? Who's that coughing?" she said. Neither of them answered. "Hasn't Winny gone yet? You shouldn't keep her out so late, dear. It's time both of you were in bed." At that he rose and went to her. Presently they could be heard moving Stanny's little cot into his grandmother's room. That night Violet slept in Ransome's bed. Ransome lay on the sofa in the front sitting room. He did not sleep, and at dawn he got up and looked out. The rain had ceased. It was the beginning of a perfect day. He remembered then that he had promised Winny to walk with her to Wimbledon Common. End of chapter 31. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 32 of the Combined Maze by May Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Chapter 32. She's ill, fair gone to pieces, but the doctor says she'll soon be all right again if we take care of her. It was early evening of Sunday. They were going slowly up the steep hill that winds, westward and southward, toward the heights of Wimbledon. He had just told her that Violet had come back. I couldn't in common decency turn her out. In a long silence he struggled to find words for what he had to say next. She saw him struggling and came to his help. "Ranny, you're going to take her back," she said. "What must you think of me?" "Think of you? I wouldn't have you different." The whole spirit of her love for him was in those words. She continued, "You see, dear, it comes to the same thing. If you didn't take her back I couldn't marry you, for it wouldn't be you. You'll have to take her." "You talk as if I'd nobody but her to think of. Look what she's making me do to you." "I'm strong enough to bear it, and she isn't. She'll go straight to the bad if we don't look after her." "That's it. She said there was nothing but the streets for her." He brooded. "If I was a rich man I could divorce her and give her an allowance to live away. I can't stand it, Winny, when I think of you." "You needn't think of me, dear. It isn't as if I hadn't known." "How could you know?" "I knew all the time she'd come back some day." "Yes, but if Father hadn't died when he did we should have been safe married. We missed it by a day. Mercier'd have married her 2 years ago. If I'd had £30 then it couldn't have happened. But I was a damned fool. I should have thought of you then. I should have let everything else go and married you." Slowly, drop by drop, he drank his misery. But she had savoured sorrow so far off that now that the cup was brought to her it had lost half its bitterness. "You couldn't have done different even then, dear. Don't worry about me. It's not as if I hadn't been happy with you. I've had you, really, Ranny, all these years." But the happiness that by way of comfort she held out to him was the very dregs of Ranny's cup. "That's it," he said. "I don't know how it's going to be now. She's the same somehow, and yet different." It was his way of expressing the fact that Violet's suffering had given her a soul, and that this soul, this subtler and more inscrutable essence of her, would not necessarily be good. It might even be malignant. Most certainly it would be hostile. It would come between them. "It's a good thing the children'll be at school now, out of her way." "P'raps she's better. Kinder, p'raps." "I don't know about that, Winny. I'm afraid. Anyhow, it'll never be the same for you and me." He paused, and then seeing suddenly the full extent of their calamity, he broke out, "What'll you do, Winny?" "I'll ask Mr. Randall if he'll take me on." "You won't stay here?" "No. Better not. I mustn't be too near, this time. That was the mistake I made before. And you've got your mother." "And what have you got?" he cried fiercely. "I've got plenty. All I've ever had. These things don't go away, dear." They stood still, looking before them, with their unspoken misery in their eyes. At their feet, down there, creeping low on the ground, spreading its packed roofs for miles over the land that had once been green fields, its red and purple smouldering and smoking in the autumn mist and sunset, there lay the paradise of little clerks. They turned and went slowly toward it down the hill. End of chapter 32. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. End of the Combined Maze by May Sinclair.